everybody. There are already almost 100 participants now in the Zoom, and there are several people at several computers, so we have probably more than 100 participants, and this is broadcast live on social media. That's why I'm very happy to have the honor to start this expert discussion, Responding to Disinformation, European Practices and Standards. It's an international online seminar that the Ministry of Culture and Information Policy has joined with its partners from the EU and the Council of Europe project, working together to support media freedom in Ukraine. I'm sure that we don't need to tell anyone how important the subject of combating disinformation is today. And the events of this past month, the decision of the president to introduce sanctions against pro-Russian TV channels has made the subject even more important. That's why I'm very happy that we have been able to gather, thanks to the EU and Council of Europe project, very experienced experts, and I hope that today we will have a very interesting dialogue today. I would like to give the floor first to Alexander Tkachenko, Minister of Culture and Information Policy of Ukraine, for his welcoming word. Good morning. I hope you can hear me. We can. I'm very happy to welcome everybody to discuss the subject that is extremely relevant for the country in general, for the president, the government. We're starting to pay quite a lot of attention to it.
Even with virtual hands attraction using these facilities.
And I would like to say that we at the ministry are now focusing especially on this issue. I'm talking about two of our initiatives that we're launching this year and in the nearest future. The first one is related to establishing a center to combat disinformation that would primarily try to cooperate with our organizations, the NGOs, trying to counter the Russian propaganda first and foremost. We're now selecting the team. We're in the process of adopting the concept. We hope the center will start functioning in March. We have close contacts with our colleagues in Latvia, the Center for Strategic Communications, and with similar centers in the European Union and in Finland. At the same time, we have started a program to coordinate our actions with the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Digitization about media literacy project, and we cooperate with the National Council for Security and Defense, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Digital Information. We hope to be able to respond to the challenges offered by the Russian propaganda as quickly as possible. We plan to work together with the fact-checking organizations to synchronize our actions, to develop a joint platform so we could not only identify the facts of fakes and manipulations, but to counter them with the help of positive Ukrainian narratives. Among our plans, we want to develop an online museum of Russian propaganda. We want to show how the Russian information machine of information aggression, how it works. And on the President Zelensky initiatives, we have plans to set up an international hub, because Ukraine is a frontier country, together with our colleagues, so that the center we're setting up now would become more, would have better capacities. I very much hope that your today's discussion will bring us some new possibilities, not only for thoughts, but for actions, including for our ministry. And I'm very happy that this event is taking place. I want to wish you a lot of inspiration and good mood. Thank you, Alexander. Now I'd like to give the floor to our colleagues from the EU delegation to Ukraine. Monsieur Duflo.
Дякую, пане Шевченко. Thank you very much.
Mr. Shevchenko.
Dear Minister Tkachenko, dear Ms. Litvinenko, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to take part in this event organized by the Council of Europe in Ukraine in the framework of the EU-funded project Support to the Freedom of Media. We are here today to discuss the problem of disinformation and the European approaches to fighting it. Disinformation, fake news have become terms far too familiar to us. They are discussed not only among experts like those present in this room, virtual room, but also somewhat paradoxically in the media themselves and in everyday conversations. Sadly, Ukraine has a direct, dramatic and long-lasting experience of how dangerous disinformation can be for any society. The continued Russian hybrid warfare against Ukraine, particularly since the illegal annexation of Crimea, has used disinformation as a tool to destabilize Ukraine politically. The latest known form of these efforts aim, as you all know it, at thwarting the forthcoming vaccination campaign. Looking at the wider context, I would like to share with you a few remarks. First, disinformation has become a recognized issue internationally. It has come to play an important role in international politics, and more so when it manages to stay low, undetectable to the public. Disinformation can also be a form of external interference on open societies and their democratic institutions. Second, when we speak about disinformation and fake news, we shall be aware that both have been around for a long time. What is new today are the possibilities offered by the internet. They allow a massive and pervasive effect reaching citizens all the time and everywhere. Third, disinformation is bad for our societies because whether it comes from external or internal actors, it sows mistrust among social groups, defiance towards the institutions. By doing this, it undermines the legitimacy of democracy. It pollutes the civic debate, adding to it layers of unjustified tension, literally out of thin air. By sharpening tensions, it incites to hate speech and inevitably violence. Fourth, especially during what I would name the COVID-19 infodemic, we have witnessed how damaging foreign interference and disinformation can be for our security. Addressing COVID-related disinformation remains an absolute necessity. Fifth, the EU has actively been tackling disinformation for many years now, especially in monitoring and countering it systematically. The European External Action Service, to which I belong, has developed a comprehensive toolbox to that effect, an action plan against disinformation in 2018, and a dedicated task force with a solid mandate. In addition, the European Democracy Action Plan of December 2020 provides guidance to ensure the integrity of elections and media pluralism, while in that context, tackling disinformation. Sixth and last remark, the EU approach is to empower a wide range of actors involving civil society, media, academia, and private sector, more importantly, online platforms and advertisers, in order to protect our democracies from foreign interference and disinformation. The EU approach is also to, while addressing disinformation, remain conscious of the importance of our values, those of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. Thus, disinformation needs to be combated altogether with respecting the freedom of expression and pluralism. We all see that there is a balance to be found here. The tension between our fundamental principles now need to be considered as a whole. By putting these principles under pressure, hostile actors are seeking to attack them. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, we, the European Union, are supporting Ukraine in its fight against disinformation and will continue to do so. EU actions have taken place in the context of the elections in 2019, with training on media crisis management for public decision makers, on response to cyber attacks, as well as awareness raising training for journalists. We are also active with a €2 million project on building capacities to resist disinformation at a local level by strengthening media literacy and supporting local high-quality media outlets. This year, we will follow up with 2 new projects. One will study Ukraine's image in selected foreign countries. The other will look into media consumption and attitude formation in the regions east of the contact line. The EU will also launch later this year an action to build strategic communication capacities at the local level. Last but not least, certainly, the high-level informal working group on strategic communication established with the government of Ukraine on the initiative of the EU delegation, the European External Action Services ad hoc task force on strategic communication, and the European Commission support group for Ukraine allows to have a constant exchange of views on disinformation-related matters. To conclude, let me say that the EU is committed to helping Ukraine in this difficult exercise to build a stronger and healthier media environment while fighting disinformation, striking the right balance to ensure that only those actors who violate professional standards and ethics to intentionally disrupt societies with manipulative tactics face consequences. In this context, we are following closely the developments regarding the election of the head of the supervisory board of the public service broadcaster and count on continued independence of this important media outlet. We know that disinformation thrives on anxiety and mistrust, which are plenty in this moment of pandemic. In this context, the time has certainly come to communicate vigorously to rebuild trust in vaccination and the underlying science. I wish you, distinguished experts, a very useful discussion during this conference, and thank you very much for your invitation.
Thank you, Mr. Duflo, for kind words and also for the support that European Union is providing for the Ukraine.
I would also like to say that I'm very happy that we can see in the chat greetings coming from Vinnytsia, Poltava, Donetsk, Severodonetsk, Ivano-Frankivsk, Dnipro, Rivne, Mykolaiv. We see that we have participants from almost all over Ukraine, but also from other countries. I'd like to give the floor now to Olena Litvinenko, the acting head of the Council of Europe office in Ukraine, our permanent partner. Olena, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Taras. Good morning, Mr. Minister, Mr. Duflo, dear experts, dear participants of this international online seminar. I'm also very happy, and it is an honor for me to welcome everybody on behalf of the Council of Europe office in Ukraine. And I would like to use this opportunity to thank our reliable partner, the Ministry of Information and Ministry of Culture and Information Policy in Ukraine, for this initiative to have this event that we have supported happily, for the cooperation we have had in the process of preparation of this event, and of course for the constructive dialogue and for a comprehensive cooperation we have with the ministry we've had for many years as part of the Council of Europe Action Plan for Ukraine for 2018 to 2022. The event of this event, first of all, is to exchange knowledge, information, and the best practices, as well as to discuss the current challenges and the ways to counter disinformation. And in that respect, I'm very happy, and I would also like to thank you for helping us to organize this event, for your participation. I want to thank the donors of the Council of Europe, our strategic partner, the EU delegation in Ukraine, represented by Monsieur Duflo, to the ambassador of Germany, Anke Feldhausen, and to the experienced experts from Sweden, Germany, Estonia, and the Council of Europe who will speak today and tomorrow. And also the experts of the National Council, National Broadcasting, the European Broadcasting Association, Facebook, the public service broadcaster who are going to speak today, who will discuss the presentations, the standards, and practices, how to respond to disinformation on the legislative level, on the policy level. We understand all the challenges related to disinformation, the attempts to manipulate public opinion in Ukraine. The Council of Europe has been providing for quite some time expert assistance and access to the international experience in this area. Now, as regards disinformation, the Council of Europe is using an approach based on human rights, where the most attention is given to the negative consequences of disinformation, for human rights, for respect of human rights as regards the right to free and fair elections, the right to expression, the right to health protection, and other rights. This comprehensive understanding of the information space and disinformation is key to develop good response, to create a safe environment that would support the freedom of expression that is guaranteed by Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights. As an governmental organizations, that is a standard-setting organization, the Council of Europe has been paying a lot of attention to creating standards in this area. Let me remind you that quite recently, a number of new standards have been developed that are to help us overcome the current challenges to counter information disorder in a comprehensive way, such as the resolution of the Parliamentary Assembly number 2326 that speaks about the main foundations of democracy and how to provide response to disinformation, how to counter it, and of the resolutions. In that resolution, the Parliamentary Assembly has expressed its concern related to disinformation campaigns, trying to manipulate public opinion and foreign interference in the election process. There is a number of the recommendations of the Committee of Ministers about the role, responsibility of the internet providers, about the influence of algorithms on human rights and other instruments. Basically, all the standards and recommendations of the Council of Europe say that by using the activities to counter disinformation, the government should make sure that such activities were legitimate, required, proportional, and constantly monitored by the parliament and by the national NGOs, the civil society. To help Ukraine implement those standards, the media projects of the Council of Europe, and in particular with support and funding of the European Union, are working to practically help Ukraine implement those standards. Let me remind you about the report of the Council of Europe called Information Disorder toward Interdisciplinary Approach to Studies and Policy Development that comprehensively studies the information disorder, offers some new terminology. Recently, a practical handbook for journalists has been developed, the rules of the information world, how the Ukrainian media should approach the European standards, which has a number of useful advice for verify information, to quote information sources, to fact check the information, and some legal advice. Improving media law would help us increase the capacities to respond to negative disinformation. Ukraine is already trying to harmonize its media legislation according to the Council of Europe standards and the EU directive on the audio-visual media services. And we hope that soon the draft law on media, the work will continue to finalize the draft law, and it would be adopted, which would become an important step for Ukraine to implement its international commitments. I should also remember the special role played by public broadcasters within the context of disinformation and propaganda that the Parliamentary Assembly stressed in its resolution 2255. Given the current media environment, we need to have a powerful, capable public broadcasting that is capable of confronting information disorder. And today, the Ukrainian public broadcaster has an important day because the new supervisory board is being elected. We're watching this process very attentively. The Council of Europe is watching it, and we hope that the election will be independent, fair, transparent, as the standards of the Council of Europe suggest. Finally, I'd like to say that there is no response to disinformation, no single response, but the countries cannot confront it alone by themselves effectively. And Monsieur Duflo has mentioned that we need to cooperate. And this is what the work of the Council of Europe is about. We want to help this cooperation between different stakeholders of the national level, the international level, between private companies, businesses, social platforms, the civil society, and the free and independent media. All those actors are playing a very important role in countering disinformation and fighting fakes. I want, on behalf of the Council of Europe office, want to wish you all today and tomorrow very fruitful work, joining your efforts, and most importantly, developing some practical steps and approaches that can help us find answers to the challenges of disinformation disorder today, and how to systemically and together respond to the challenges and remove those challenges that Ukraine is facing today. Thank you very much and have a very fruitful work today.
Thank you, Lena. In your speech, you actually talked a lot of very important and relevant issues on the information, the law on media, and the ethical standards, and most probably your last message about having not just a discussion, but practical recommendation resonates the most, so that we could implement them in real life. And it is very cool that we have both experts from Ukraine and experts from other countries who have their own experience. Disinformation, fakes, even though they are not a new phenomenon in the informational environment, everybody faces these challenges in a new way. And most probably we cannot say that somebody has an ideal recipe. And most probably it is Ukraine, being a country on the border with Russia, a country which to a great extent receives the most of disinformation waves and has the most experience of countering all this, also has things to share. And after some time, the work of the Center for Counter Disinformation is going to have even more experience and practices to share with other countries. And I just want to add once more that I'm very happy. And in the following session, actually, it's going to be after this video address in session number 1. We also have a consultant from the Council of Europe and the moderator. So together with the Council of Europe, with Christina, we discussed how we could plan this event. And we know that for many years, this expert has become really experienced. And I think that everybody knows Mr. McGonagall, who is another consultant of the Council of Europe from the Netherlands. We also participate in different events with him, including those in the Netherlands. That's also a very experienced expert. And the first session in just several minutes now with Christina and McGonagall about international standards and comparing national approaches of countering disinformation. And before that, we have the ambassador of Germany in Ukraine. There is a video address.
Dear Minister, dear Olena, dear participants, I'm honored to speak at today's seminar on disinformation, which has become particularly significant due to the events of the last few weeks. Ukraine is not the only country to be faced with the question of how to deal with disinformation and fake news. The suspension of Donald Trump's Twitter account has sparked global discussions about whether a private company can make a decision of such a magnitude. The blocking of the 3 TV channels 112, ZIK and News 1 in the week before last, and the almost simultaneous withdrawal of licenses of several Russian channels in Latvia have once again led to the debate in Europe on where plurality of opinion stops and disinformation starts. We then received the news from China that the BBC will be banned there on the grounds of spreading disinformation. While Twitter's decision surely has caused headaches with regard to the restriction of freedom of expression, most of us will have nevertheless breathed a sigh of relief that we are no longer startled every morning by the latest tweets from the US. And many of us, knowing the situation here, have shown sympathy for the decision to block Taras Kozak's TV channels. However, the example from China in particular shows the dangers inherent to this debate and on how to deal with fake news and disinformation. The boundaries between legitimate plurality of opinion, including controversial ones, on the one hand, and harmful disinformation on the other hand, are not always crystal clear, unfortunately. In addition, we have to admit that they depend heavily on our own view of the world. And we always have to keep in mind that any regulations, even if made with the best of intentions, can also be abused or turned against ourselves. Ukraine is certainly at the forefront when it comes to hybrid information campaigns and disinformation. This is why this topic has been discussed controversially here for years. With all the need to protect the information space, as it is called here, there's also the need to protect democracy, freedom of expression, and freedom of the press, and to weigh the two against each other. The fact that we are discussing this in such detail today and tomorrow at the invitation of the Ministry of Culture and Information and the Council of Europe shows that our Ukrainian partners take this very seriously. And I'm therefore all the more pleased that our colleague from Berlin, Simon Kreyer, who heads the steering group on strategic communication, will today give insights into the German strategy against disinformation and hybrid threats and convey best practices and standards that can hopefully also be of value to Ukraine. We are, of course, always available for exchanges with our Ukrainian partners beyond the seminar. But today and tomorrow, I wish you all a lively exchange of mind and new insights. Thank you very much and have a good time.
And we thank Madam Ambassador. On this, we're finishing the first block of our introductory words, and now I give the floor to Christina Rozgoni. She's going to moderate the first block of the first session. Christina?
Thank you so much. Thank you, and it's really wonderful, even in this remote mood, to see you and be with you together at this very important event. Thank you so much for inviting us, and thank you so much for involving us in this strategically important and urgent matter. So the first speaker of today's event could not be anyone better than my wonderful colleague Tarlak McConaughey from the Netherlands, who has a very extensive, I would say, both academically and both from the policy world experience on how to interpret, how to use, how to take seriously international standards and comparative national approaches to countering disinformation. So Tarlak the floor is yours, and after your speech, we would welcome questions and answers to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina, for the floor. Minister, Deputy Minister, esteemed colleagues and esteemed participants, it's a great pleasure for me to be here today and to give you an overview of the international standards and comparative national approaches to countering disinformation. This will be, I think, a little bit of scene setting at the start of the day, and just to set out the broad international framework. So thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much to the organizing team for the excellent preparations. Now, I understand that my PowerPoint presentation will be, it is visible, and I see nodding there, so that's great. Next slide, please. As the formal international treaties that govern this area of expression do not specifically deal with the term disinformation, I've agreed with the organizers that we would smuggle in a little bit of analysis of some of the definitional problems that we deal with. So the absence of definitions of disinformation are very relevant for how the international standards deal with them. So that will be my first focus today. Then I will move on to international standards, which will necessarily include some attention for European standards, although I'm very conscious of the fact that there are excellent speakers coming after me, so that will be limited, and they will focus more on the Council of Europe and the European Union. I will then give a brief overview of some of the initiatives that are coming on stream at the national level to engage in different ways with disinformation, and time permitting, I will throw out a few ideas for solutions and strategies. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So we live in a post-truth society, so we're told. What does that mean? It means that we live in a society where facts, evidence, expert opinions, and rational debate are very often discredited and dismissed by certain politicians and by certain groups in society. And the previous speakers, and I'm grateful to them for that, the previous speakers have already highlighted that this can have very far-reaching harmful consequences for democracy. Democracy which thrives on pluralistic public debate, where a range of media and other actors, including individuals and organizations, can participate effectively in discussions of matters of public concern. Next slide, please. The current phase of engaging with disinformation, both in academic scholarship, but also very importantly at regulatory and policy levels, it was initially concerned with the term fake news, as it's called. This term is still used usually by politicians and organizations who want to frame the issue in a certain way. But I think it's fair to say that scholarship and European and international policy making has taken a deliberate distance from the term. There are three reasons for that. First is it's very open-ended and susceptible to misuse and abuse. It is a term behind which many different types of expression are present, and it just isn't helpful because it is so open-ended and vague. And certainly if the term was to be a basis for any kind of regulation, it wouldn't meet the international standards for precision and clarity that are required. This is also the second point, that it is vague and undifferentiated. And the third reason for distancing ourselves from the term is that it tends to be politicized, or some would say weaponized, in that it is used as a term to undermine independent, critical voices in journalism and the media and the civil society sector and public debate more generally. So these are three reasons to move on from fake news, and the emerging term is disinformation. And if we go to the next slide, please. I love this infographic from the European from the EAVI, and it tries to look beyond the term fake news and break it down into its component parts. So here you will see, we can't really see it on the slide, but the slides will be available afterwards, and you can see that they very carefully break down different types of expression that could be understood as being fake news or disinformation. And this is very important because the types of expression that are potentially covered by the term are not all the same. Satire, for instance, is ordinarily protected under the European Convention on Human Rights because satire, by its nature, seeks to provoke and agitate and unlock opinions in the public and thereby contribute to public debate. So from a broad democratic perspective, it's important that such expression would ordinarily be protected. Clickbait is another type of expression that is often considered to be disinformation, and that has narrow, very narrow commercial purposes, and that's again of a different order. Then we have conspiracy theories and hoaxes, of course, and we've certainly seen, not just in political terms, but also with the ongoing corona crisis and pandemic, that conspiracy theories can potentially have very serious impact on public health and information concerning medical and health issues. So they need to be taken with due seriousness. And then, of course, a form of disinformation that will be preoccupying us in this conference is disinformation of a more ideological nature, and disinformation that seeks to manipulate or disrupt public debate or democratic processes such as elections and referenda. And also there's an important transfrontier dimension in this particular respect. So important to differentiate between the different types of expression lurking behind the term disinformation, and to think in terms specifically of the harms that each of them cause or potentially cause, and to look at what the most effective and proportionate responses would be to each, always bearing in mind the right to freedom of expression. Next, and here again, as we can see from the infographic, it's very important also to look at the impact and the motivation or intention of the speaker or organization behind particular expression. Next slide, please. Disinformation and fake news have been preoccupying concerns at the international level for a long time. What's new about the current wave is the technological dimension. We have to deal with a number of technological and societal game changers. We need to look, I think, in the first place at the ease with which disinformation is created, the sophistication of that content, whether it's produced as text, image, or video. Deep fakes being a recent and current phenomenon, the scale at which they can be produced by using technological initiatives to ensure that there is mass spreading of such content, the speed at which such content can go viral, the amplification through algorithmic intervention, how prominent that content can be made, largely through the big tech companies and platforms that are crucial for its dissemination, the effectiveness with which this content can impact on its intended and unintended audiences because of its sophistication and professional appearance, and also because it perhaps taps into disillusionment with certain sections of society. The variety of content, so you get it through all different media and communications outlets, and the permanence of its online presence, that this can have a compounding effect and that it can be reinforced across the online ecosystem. Next slide, please. So the previous slide shows that it's a very complex phenomenon in the current information ecosystem. And this means that it's multidimensional, and any responses require a multi-actor engagement. The Council of Europe had the foresight a few years ago to commission an expert study by Claire Wardle and Hossein Dereksham, Information Disorder. Very detailed, very insightful study of this whole phenomenon of information disorder, as the authors called it. The study was released in September 2017, and because of its depth and expert character, and also because it was one of the first big policy documents at the European level in this latest wave of discussion, it became very, very influential. Next slide, please. One of the main reasons for its influential character is the conceptual disaggregation of the term, of relevant terms that it provides. And here you see in a snapshot what that disaggregation concerns. Disinformation, so the authors tell us, is information that is false and deliberately created to harm a person, social group, organization, or country. Okay, that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the presentation. Misinformation, according to the authors, is information that's false but not created with the intention of causing harm. Malinformation, for its part, is information that is based on reality, used to inflict harm on a person, organization, or country. Next slide, please. And here we see, through a very useful Venn diagram, again from the aforementioned study, that in that interface, in that intersection at the center of the Venn diagram, you find disinformation, and this typically involves false context, imposter content, manipulated content, and fabricated content. And again, what we need to remember here is that there is a deliberate intention. And according to Wardle and Derrickson, there is the intention is to harm a person, social group, organization, or society. Now, you don't find in dictionary definitions, you don't find that reference to harm, but it has been included in this particular definition. And as I say, the definition has proved very influential, both at the EU level and through appropriation by a lot of organizations, such as the European Broadcasting Union and the ERGA, the European Regulatory Group for Audiovisual Media. Next slide, please. Now, having addressed the definitional dilemmas, I would like to proceed to the UN system for the protection of freedom of expression, and that will be a springboard to seeing what they say about disinformation specifically. Next slide, please. This is a very quick overview of the UN treaty-based system and the dynamics that take place in and around that treaty-based system. You see here very quickly at the bottom of the treaty-based structure references to Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and just above that, Article 19 and 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They're central in this whole system, and the texts of those articles have influenced other treaties. For example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And what these provisions say about freedom of expression generally can be of specific relevance for disinformation. And we'll see that disinformation can impact on children in different ways, for example, or that there may be specific requirements for persons with disabilities, and they are addressed in the relevant convention there as well. So important to see that these general provisions flow through into other ones, and the one of the key actors in engaging with disinformation at the UN level is UNESCO, of course, and they've produced a number of studies and reports on this. And the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression has recently concluded a public consultation on online disinformation, and we can expect to see the results of that soon. Next slide, please. Here we have the text of Article 19 ICCPR. It will be familiar to many of you. It sets out the broad right to freedom of expression, but acknowledges that in certain specific, well-defined circumstances, it may be possible to limit that broad right. And that's when such restrictions are provided by law and are necessary for respect of the rights or reputations of others, or for the protection of national security or public order, or of public health or morals. In Article 20, there is a reference to the obligation on states to prohibit, amongst other things, propaganda for war. But those provisions are as close as we get to a specific reference to disinformation. So the challenge would be to see where disinformation would fit in this configuration. Now, that there is no specific reference to disinformation is not that surprising, but it was very much a preoccupation of the drafters. During the drafting process, back in the early 60s, there was a great political concern internationally about the influences of disinformation. Next slide, please. So, concretely, on the drafting table was the following ground for limiting freedom of expression: the systematic diffusion of deliberately false or distorted reports which undermine friendly relations between peoples and states. Quintessential disinformation, also in contemporary terms, but it didn't survive the drafting process. It didn't get included into the final text. So this is to show that, you know, this has always been a preoccupation at the international level. Next slide, please. In the absence of specific treaty provisions on disinformation, it's important to look at other political standards, actors, and mechanisms within the UN system. One of those, as mentioned, is the UN Special Rapporteur. Every year, the Special Rapporteur adopts, together with the OSCE representative on freedom of the media and their equivalent mandate holders for the Americas and Africa, a joint annual declaration on a current topic relating to freedom of expression. In 2017, that topic was fake news, disinformation, and propaganda. Next slide, please. Now, this joint declaration isn't legally binding on states, but if you look at who's adopted it, you can see that these are the heavyweights for freedom of expression internationally and regionally. So these declarations, although they're not legally binding in a formal sense, they provide a very good interpretation and contemporary interpretation of the existing standards. Key features, so very useful, I think, when states want to get guidance on how to shape their national approaches. This is structured in terms of general principles, standards on disinformation and propaganda, an enabling environment for freedom of expression, the particular role of intermediaries, journalists and media outlets, and stakeholders' cooperation. To summarize this in one or two sentences, here you see the complexity of the topic, the broad relevance of international standards that need to be interpreted in a way that recognizes and engages with the reality of the phenomenon in the current communications context. The enabling environment for freedom of expression is really important because it opens up a space in which state actors, but also the media and intermediaries and civil society and educationalists and a whole range of actors can play their part in engaging with and countering disinformation. So very, very important to emphasize this. And I'm very pleased to hear the previous speakers, including the minister, engaging with this multiple level of the problem and the need to have a coalition or collaboration between different actors to effectively address it. Next slide, please. And as we have already heard from the previous speakers, the Council of Europe, the EU, and also the OSCE are doing very important and often pioneering work in this field. Next slide, please. It's important just to take 1 second to look at the complexity of European level regulation. On the one hand, you've got treaties such as the European Convention on Human Rights and the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, but also regulation like the e-commerce directive from the EU, and then political or policy standards, as my colleague Urška Umek will discuss later, the Committee of Ministers approach at the Council of Europe, and also the space that is opened up for self or co-regulation. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So with full confidence in Urška's presentation later, it will be excellent. I'll limit myself to just giving this overview here. The three main prongs to the Council of Europe's approach. And next slide, please. And I would like to dwell on this quote from the European Court of Human Rights from the Dink case, in which the court spells out the very important positive obligation of states, which is very relevant, I think, for opening up a space to counter disinformation in relevant ways. And it reads that states are obliged to put in place an effective system of protection for authors and journalists. That's very important if, you know, if journalists are being willfully undermined by certain politicians or regimes, that they be protected physically and psychologically. Moving on from that, it's part of a broader obligation to create a favorable environment for participation in public debate by everyone, and to enable the expression of opinions and ideas without fear, even when they are contrary to those held by authorities or by a significant section of public opinion, and even if they're annoying or shocking for the latter. So very, very important reaffirmation of robust public debate in which everybody can participate, and that insists on the importance of pluralistic media, including public service media, media literacy, so that the public are able to engage with media content, know where it's coming from, assess it critically, and therefore form their own opinions without being manipulated by disinformation. Next slide, please. Then, grateful to Mr. Duflo for having given us a quick preview of the EU's approach to these issues, and another colleague will be speaking in a later session. So maybe the value of these next slides will be for after the conference, just to give you in a more patient way an overview of what is going on. So first of all, next slide, please. Quick snapshot of the relevant regulatory and self-regulatory measures that are shaping this area within the European Union. Again, you can digest that at your convenience afterwards. Next slide, please. The European Commission's measures to tackle disinformation, as you can see, engage with the multidimensional and multi-actor nature of the whole phenomenon. So you see in the first place the Code of Practice on Defamation, emphasis on fact-checking, the need for a secure European online platform in disinformation, media literacy is very prominent there, specific support for member states when it comes to the resilience of elections. And I welcome the earlier reference to the democracy action plan of the EU, very important attention for the topic there, and the promotion of voluntary online identification systems and support for quality and diversified information. Next slide, please. This is again for digestion later, a helpful timeline of the different initiatives taken from the European Commission's website. Next slide, please. Much of the emphasis from the EU is on the Code of Practice on Disinformation, which has been which is a self-regulatory initiative, and signatories include major tech companies and also representatives of the advertising sector. Very important, of course, to have the advertising sector on board because of political advertising and issue-based advertising, as well as clickbait and so forth. So here are a few of the key aims or key points within the Code of Practice on Disinformation. And again, it seeks to have a multi-level engagement with the topic. Transparency about sponsored content is very important. You need to know where it's coming from in order to assess its validity and its relevance and its bona fides. Greater clarity about the functioning of algorithms and enabling third-party verification. If algorithmic intervention is so important in ensuring the dissemination and amplification of content, then it's imperative that there be more transparency about and accountability for the deployment of such algorithmic techniques. And again, there's a lot to be said for exposure to a diversity of opinions which are at the very heart of public debate in democratic societies, and active measures need to be taken to enhance that. Some technical measures that can be deployed are to identify and close fake accounts and tackle the issue of automatic bots. And then finally, we see the role for fact checkers, researchers, public authorities, and the monitoring of online content. Next slide, please. Going to wrap up, Christina, in a minute here. Just I've got my eye on the clock here. 5 pillars of commitments to the code, and again, please digest it and look into it at your convenience, because there is a wealth of detail there. Now, this is a self-regulatory initiative, as I say, so it's very important that there is external scrutiny of adherence to the code, and that's kept under review by states and civil society and academia in order to ensure that it's not a pro forma exercise and is meaningful in practice. Now, next slide, please. The diversity of approaches at the national level is overwhelming, so I'm going to strategically just limit it to a few observations. A great resource for finding out what's going on at regulatory, but also self-regulatory and non-regulatory levels across different European countries, specifically the European Union, is a recent report by the ERGA, the European Regulators Group for Audiovisual Media Services, adopted or issued at the end of last year. It's entitled Notions of Disinformation and Related Concepts. And a spoiler, or to give you the executive summary, only one EU member state has a statutory definition of disinformation, that's Lithuania, but a lot of states have kind of indirect engagement in their statute books, but also in other approaches with the term. So the absence of a specific definition in statutes is not by any means the end of the story. What's also noteworthy in this regard is that 14 of the EU member states are in some way or another contemplating future legislative action or initiatives dealing in some way with disinformation. Next slide, please. And here, if you want a broader perspective on what's going on at the national level, I would commend the Poynter Institute's interactive overview of disinformation at the global level. That's a very useful resource, and then you can see beyond the EU what's going on. So I'm going to wrap up here in the interest of time with 2 more slides. I'm going to skip the strategies and solutions. I think there'll be plenty of input from participants in that regard. But a brief typology of national trends is, in the first place, regulatory zeal. For different reasons, some governments are very keen to regulate disinformation. Famous policymaker once joked that once something exists, regulators want to regulate it. That's known as the regulator's itch. They want to start scratching at it immediately. This is something that we see across different states, particularly in governments or regimes that are more authoritarian or keen to suppress freedom of political and public debate. On the other hand, you will see in other countries, such as the Netherlands, a certain amount of reserve on the part of the authorities. They feel that the broader framework for the protection of freedom of expression, the current state of media pluralism and trust in journalism and the media is such that there is not an immediate need for specific regulatory intervention, that the existing safeguards are adequate and proportionate. Self-regulatory zeal. Some national governments are very keen to outsource responsibility to the big tech companies in particular and let them deal with it, and then they push for self or co-regulatory models. This also falls squarely with the sharing and spreading of responsibilities. Everybody should play their part, and I think that is the current wisdom also at the international and European levels, multi-actor to engage with the multiple levels of the problem. And then maybe finally the corona factor, and if you go to the next slide, I can round off with that. So one thing that we have seen over the past 12 months is that the pandemic, and accompanying infodemic has been used as a pretext by certain regimes to adopt regulatory or other measures that are detrimental to freedom of expression and public debate. They can affect freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, media freedom, the ability to report on these issues, to attend official press conferences and briefings where participation is sometimes restricted by access issues, access to information requests, sometimes delayed, postponed, or not honored on the pretext of not being able to get at the information physically. And then, of course, freedom of assembly, to protest against measures. How far should that go? When do we reach the tipping point that it endangers public health and should perhaps be restricted? And then finally, public and individual health. If there is disinformation specifically about vaccines or the nature of COVID, can that then be a legitimate ground for limiting freedom of expression? I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. And if I'd be very pleased to hear them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor McGonagall. Thank you, and especially thank you for setting the scene for these 2 days. We are going to go deeper and into details, and thank you so much really to mapping up this year's scene. We have received questions to your presentation, especially on I would highlight questions that are concerned about the balancing act and how to find the fine line between legal counteraction to disinformation, ensuring the right to information and to freedom of expression can be drawn. And also I wish to join this question whether you could name or highlight any national or international measure that you would consider as a best practice in this regard. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for these questions. Great questions. As I hinted in my presentation, freedom of expression is the point of departure, and if there are to be any limitations on freedom of expression, they need to be narrowly drawn, they need to be necessary, they need to be prescribed by law, and they also need to correspond very closely to the permissible grounds for those for such limitations. Now we'll see, I'm sure, in Urška Umek's presentation in a few moments, that the European Court of Human Rights has developed a very detailed body of case law on this. And I think that's particularly relevant. You know, there's a richness of detail there that's very relevant for European states in that regard. And the crucial consideration is whether any proposed regulation or any would-be limitation on freedom of expression strictly meets all of the criteria that have been developed so carefully by the European Court of Human Rights in particular. Now, I insist on the European Court of Human Rights because even though the UN Human Rights Committee has very relevant jurisprudence as well, there is just so much more detail in the European Court's approach. So that's very important, and I don't want to steal Urška's thunder, but that I'm sure will come out very strongly in her presentation. She's a great expert on that, and you also see the influence of that case law on the other standard setting by the Council of Europe. Now, I found it very difficult to identify one single best practice at the national level because there is such a complex array of factors in each country, but if you were to come up with a blueprint for best practice, it is one that would be driven by freedom of expression concerns, and to resist the regulatory itch and not regulate just for the sake of it. If you're going to contemplate regulatory measures, it's important to be very clear-sighted about the particular harms that you would be seeking to address, and also the how you would address it, why you're going to address it, how you're going to address it, and just really distinguish between the types of harmful expression types of harmful disinformation that would merit some kind of regulation, and the large volume of other types of disinformation which would be best dealt with through investing in quality, independent public service media, quality journalism, media literacy initiatives, fact-checking. And again, none of these are a silver bullet in themselves. It's important to insist on the array of measures. And again, very important to get the big, dominant, influential tech companies on board and get them to raise their game through a variety of measures. They can do so much at a technical level to influence the flow of information and disinformation, and very important for them to strictly respect their human rights responsibilities across all of their services.
Thank you so much. We hope to hear the responses of the big tech representatives also during the event. And again, thank you so much for this really worthy and great start to our discussions. And now we give the floor to Ms. Urszka Umak and to Galina. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.
Доброго дня, шановні учасники. Вітаю вас всіх. Хочу нагадати, що в нас...
Hello, dear participants. Greetings to everyone. We actually have a 2-hour event, and the whole first block of the event are dedicated to answers to disinformation, the level strategy, state policies, standards in the European Union. And also today we're going to present in detail the standards of the Council of Europe, which were already mentioned today. Actually, it is the Council of Europe that is the organization which develops those standards. And actually, it has lots of standards on freedom of expression. And I'm very happy that today with us we have Urszka Umek, who is the head of the media department, Department of Informational Society in the Council of Europe, who is going to tell us in more detail about the standards of the Council of Europe. And also I would like to note that the Council of Europe does huge work in identifying the science of informational disorder, studying this phenomenon, and also working out standards. And the projects of the Council of Europe locally, for example, in Ukraine, our project, which is called European Union and the Council of Europe working jointly to support media freedom in Ukraine, we also do a lot of work in this field. In particular, we translate standards and we publish the manuals for journalists. We actually have monitoring and also other different events. You can find out on the Council of Europe website. And now I give the floor to Urszka.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. This is how I begin every presentation as of probably 1 year. So Galina, can you just give me thumbs up if you can? Okay, excellent. Good morning or good afternoon to Kiev time, I suppose. It is really a pleasure to join you at this online seminar. I wish to thank the organizers for the great job that you have already done with preparing this event. Thank you also for inviting me to present the Council of Europe's approaches and responses to disinformation. Thank you also to my dear colleague Tarlok McGonigal, who has so successfully set the scene and has also entrusted me, I think, during his presentation with certain responsibilities in terms of articulating certain things. And thank you also to Olena and Galina, who have already pointed out that the Council of Europe is primarily a standard-setting organization. So maybe we will begin there. I have a presentation. If you could possibly start sharing it, that would be great. Thank you very much. Right, so we are a standard-setting organization, as has been pointed out, which means, of course, that we primarily developed legal standards and policies for tackling various social issues which may affect human rights, may affect the rule of law and democracy. But we also do research on emerging issues, as was also shown in Tarlak's presentation. So we want to have some good, solid evidentiary basis for whatever standards we then propose should be put in place by our member states in regard to any of these issues that we tackle. Given the importance of and this huge surge of the phenomenon of disinformation, of course, one would expect that the Council of Europe would be developing standards to counter the phenomenon, and we do. However, disinformation is a complex, not always clear notion. So also the responses to this phenomenon are complex, and they actually involve a variety of different measures. Now, most of these measures will not be directly targeting disinformation, as we will see. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Right, so Tarlak has already presented you with this Venn diagram to put a little bit of clarity into the notion of disinformation. And indeed, the disinformation, so these are the messages that deliberately manipulate reality and facts, and they have a specific intention of causing harm or indeed profiting financially. So it's also used by people to profit from. Now, that is arguably the most worrying aspect of the entire phenomenon of information disorder. But as we have also seen, for example, last year with the outbreak of COVID-19, there was a rise also in unintentional mistakes and false narratives that fall under the category of misinformation. So this is one thing that I would like to emphasize, because these narratives were not born out of malice, not born out of intention to cause harm. But they were born out of fear, either of fear of the virus or fear of the outbreak being abused by the authorities or powerful elites. And misinformation blossomed as well, especially in the beginning when we didn't have that much information about the virus. And it's still blossoming, actually. For example, now it's the issue of vaccination that is hot topic. We could see, and we can still see, that it is not only about this deliberate attempts, it's also about mistakes and lack of correct information that can cause very serious consequences. So this is also one of the things that we need to start tackling as well. So if we now can go to next slide, and we will start with what are the main problems that we have identified in our research at the Council of Europe, main problems with this disinformation. So first of all, it's the exposure. It is not easy to measure how many people are effectively exposed to disinformation. Why? Because, well, most of it is done through self-assessment surveys, and most people are not very good at recognizing disinformation, so they wouldn't even know that they're consuming it. But still, especially with the outbreak of COVID, there have been quite many surveys done. And we have got a Norwegian source here in the slide. And according to that source, nearly 1/2 of the population was exposed to disinformation. And I have to say, we have observed similar numbers across Europe. We have got some others, for example, UK, where their media regulator was also measuring the same thing, came to the same conclusion, about 1/2 of people were exposed to disinformation. So it's a lot of exposure that disinformation gets to start with. Then if we go to the next slide. Now, the problem is, of course, that it compounds it, that when one is bombarded with disinformation, it leads people to lose trust in information and in news sources as such. It creates a lot of confusion, as was already pointed out earlier already, about whether we can trust any kind of information and who is exploiting information and to what gain. So here we see, for example, in the Edelman Trust Barometer of last year, then more than 3/4 of respondents were concerned that disinformation can be weaponized for certain political goals or against certain groups. And that is important to know because people obviously do not trust anymore what they see and read. So if we go to the next slide. Indeed, I mean, with this potential to mislead and manipulate, to create this confusion, disinformation can not only affect our perception of reality or the sense of societal unity, it can also be a great concern for national security. These are all serious concerns. But for the Council of Europe, of course, one concern in particular that we wish to tackle is the potential of disinformation to affect a number of human rights. So I have put a few of them on the slide. I didn't want to overdo it, but there are many more that can be affected. For example, we see time and again how disinformation can be used to ignite discrimination against certain minority or vulnerable groups. If I go back to the example of COVID, which I will be using throughout a little bit because it's a fresh example, it started with discrimination against the Chinese because that is where the virus originated from. But then it sort of shifted and moved, for example, to refugees and migrants because they could be carriers of the virus. And then it sort of became quite general, and everybody who was who was affected has sort of been, vilified as somebody presenting grave danger. So that is, for example, one of the potential negative, adverse consequences on human rights. But no lesser problem, as already exposed by Tarlok, no lesser problem than the effect of disinformation itself on certain human rights is how it is tackled and what kind of measures are taken in response to disinformation. And this we see in case of freedom of expression, because indeed too restrictive responses to disinformation pose risks to freedom of expression. So, for example, criminalization of information that is considered false, that can lead to censorship and it can lead to suppression of critical voices in society, especially because it gives the state the power to decide what is accurate and what is false. And that is not really the power that states should have. And that is, again, one of the unintended consequences that we have seen in the outbreak of COVID. And we will pick up on this point later, but let's go to the next slide. And perhaps just go very gently through a number of factors that facilitate the rise of disinformation. Now, Tarlok has presented very well how the advances in technology have affected this rise in disinformation, because indeed huge volumes of messages traveling at unprecedented speed can facilitate it very much. Now, of course, this sort of taps into a greater shift that we have seen in the entire information and communication environment, which has sort of moved very much online. So we have got now online platforms which distribute a large part of all content that we see and read. So where do we tend to go for our news nowadays? Well, we tend to go online. And now the platforms are called new gatekeepers of information, because they are the ones that essentially decide what is worthy of our that is the user's attention, what should be ranked high, what should be most visible for us to consume. But what happens is that the platforms make their editorial decisions without attention to whether the sources that they publish are at all reliable. So they're not like media in this respect. They do not really abide by the rules of journalistic profession or ethics. What they do, on the other hand, is they push very attractive content. So they're interesting for users. And if they're interesting for users, they're interesting also for advertisers, meaning that they make a lot of profit out of what they show. On the other hand, the media, of course, is getting less profit. That is just how it is. When one is profiting more, the other one is not. So media, of course, being impoverished, they produce less original content, which translates into less reliable content as well. Not that all media are reliable, of course, but I think that the expectations for the media, and sometimes they're justified, sometimes not, expectations still are that they would abide by journalistic ethics. And indeed, if the media don't do their job properly or can't do their job properly, well, then we also don't have content that is capable of countering any false narratives, to correct the false narratives. So basically, then that results, of course, in our mistrust of all information. And if we go to the next slide, which is about who should act against disinformation, we can see that there is a number of groups that have been identified. And indeed, they all, or we all, have our particular roles to play in this let's say, disinformation battle. There's journalists, national authorities, media, citizens themselves or ourselves. There's internet companies, and then also international institutions and NGOs. So if we go to the next slide, what can each of these categories do? We have tried to already answer this a little bit in the information disorder, our study from 2017 that has also already been mentioned. And the study, what it does, it also provides some recommendations for each of the groups on what they should ideally be doing. So for example, journalists, what can journalists do? Well, the job and mission of journalism is to produce accurate and reliable information. So, that is definitely the first thing. The second thing would be, of course, to avoid from disseminating fabricated content. Also very important. But they can also do one other thing. They can debunk disinformation, meaning that they can call it for what it is. Then for the national authorities, as Tarlak has said, national authorities, of course, have the power of regulation. And they can regulate, they can introduce requirements, legal requirements, for example, with regard to the transparency on platforms. They can also require the platforms to remove certain kind of content. Caution to be exercised there, because all of that, of course, needs to be proportionate, needs to be legal, it needs to be legitimate and proportionate. However, it can and should, in certain cases, be done. Now, what can citizens do? Well, we can educate ourselves about disinformation to better identify it, to avoid engaging with it, to avoid spreading it. But definitely the biggest job here is for the online platforms, given, of course, where most of disinformation appears. So they can prioritize reliable sources, they can provide transparent criteria for their algorithms and how they rank the content, which is very important because ranking can also lead to unintended consequences. And transparency enables us to be able to assess the impact of algorithms that decide what content we actually see and can find. And also, very importantly, online platforms have the power to prevent sites with disinformation from profiting from it. So they can prohibit or remove the possibility of advertising from those platforms. If we go to the next slide, and see what is the current situation, who is doing what. In the past years, I have to say, we have seen progress in terms of the general awareness of disinformation, ability to recognize it, and also ability to counter it through a number of measures. But the prevailing policies in Europe often entrust the important task of deliberating what is true, what is false, what should be removed, what shouldn't, and also impose liability for that on online platforms, especially social media platforms are really exposed here. Platforms indeed are the ones that can do most in terms of direct impact of quantity of disinformation circulating. But there are two issues to take into account that we need to sort of be a bit cautious about. First of all, platforms do that through mostly through automated decision-making, which is combined with human editors, but still. They cannot be particularly granular, particularly nuanced in their approaches because there's simply too much content to be screened. And also, there is a big question whether online platforms are actually qualified for the job, especially because right now we do not yet have independent oversight of their takedown practices. So some of them routinely remove or block content without explaining why. And of course, that leads to legitimate forms of expression being removed as well. Now, that, of course, is a risk to freedom of expression. But this leads us to even a bigger question, which is, of course, what should be done with disinformation when we detect it? How should it be tackled? And that, in a way, has its answer, partial answer, in finding out whether false content is also illegal content. Now, most types of disinformation do not attain the levels of harm that we associate with illegal content. So typically illegal content, for example, would involve, depictions of sexual abuse of children, for example, or advocacy of terrorist acts, or promoting or inciting crime or violence online or offline, obviously. But most disinformation does not really present such dangers to society. So how should then such false content be treated? Does it enjoy protection under freedom of expression standards? And if we go to the next slide, we can answer that, yes, indeed it does. Here I will tap into a little bit the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. And I will say that this case law does imply that Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which of course guarantees, enshrines the right to freedom of expression and information. Now, that right offers protection also to statements whose truthfulness or accuracy can be called into question. First of all, there is one thing to be mentioned. There is a difference between opinions and factual statements. Now, factual statements are susceptible to being accurate or false, but opinions or value judgments really are not. So there is one huge category, which I'm sure that some people would describe as disinformation, but would not really fall under it. But then if we go to factual statements, I have a case, for example, here on the slide. It's a Ukrainian case of Salov from 2005, where we have had an applicant who was involved in a presidential electoral campaign, and he disseminated a few copies of a forged edition of a parliamentary newspaper. And that newspaper said, and this was a false statement, that the then president of Ukraine, Mr. Leonid Kuchma, was dead. Now, Mr. Salov was then arrested for spreading this misinformation, and he was placed in detention. But when the court when the Strasbourg Court decided on the issue, they said that Article 10 did not and does not prohibit discussion or dissemination of information received, even if it is strongly suspected that that information might not be truthful. What the court also said was that to suggest otherwise would deprive people of the right to express their views and opinions about statements made in mass media, and it would place an unreasonable restriction on freedom of expression. So if we go to the next slide now, this is very, very important to keep in mind. So even if we suspect that something is untrue, that does not necessarily mean that it's not protected under the European Convention. But also what that case does give us is a picture of how incredibly difficult it is to balance, on the one hand, the legitimate need to have a culture of reliable, trustworthy information, and on the other hand, freedom of expression with its wide scope. How hard it is to find appropriate and especially proportionate responses. So now I will go a little bit into what our organization also does to end this presentation. Indeed, it is not only the court, of course, that engages with disinformation. In fact, it is also a number of our other entities and bodies. And our human rights-based approach to disinformation is to generally address the adverse negative human rights impacts that are caused by disinformation, rather than tackle all disinformation itself. So we focus on the empowerment of quality journalism, for example, and we're in the process of adopting a recommendation on promoting a favorable environment for quality journalism that will offer a lot of guidance also in terms of financial stability, but also editorial principles for good quality journalism. Then another thing that is very important is uninhibited access to official documents. To that end, we have adopted a convention on access to official documents, the Tromsø Convention, which has recently actually entered into force, also thanks to Ukraine, one of the 10 first ratifications. And indeed, it's so important for the public to have easy and readily available access to authoritative information that can be provided by public authorities. Then the third, let's say, avenue of our work would be empowerment of users. So enhancing our critical thinking skills, our media and information literacy. And we have started this work with a study on supporting quality journalism through media and information literacy, which kind of analyzes all the skills that we need for that, to recognize and to value quality journalism, but also to avoid disinformation. So that is one, I would say, important part of our work. And then, of course, we also have two more technical avenues of work. One is rules on online platforms, transparency and compliance with human rights. I will say a few words later. And the other one would be working on algorithms and artificial intelligence systems, because these systems can be employed to either detect and take down disinformation, that is true, but they also carry some risks of manipulation, and they can be used by those that spread disinformation. So it is possible to target individuals, for example, through very personalized messages intended for them from very selected sources to sort of let's say, influence their opinions. And you can even influence results of elections in that way. So we have adopted one declaration on the manipulative capabilities of algorithmic processes to tackle this issue. And last year, we have also adopted a recommendation on the human rights impacts of algorithmic systems. And now if we go to the next slide, This is one recommendation. If there is one thing that I would like you to sort of retain from the presentation, it would be this recommendation on the roles and responsibilities of internet intermediaries from 2018, because here we see very well this interplay, the shared responsibility between states and internet intermediaries, so also online platforms, although internet intermediaries is a wider notion, but they do share the responsibility for safeguarding human rights in the online space. So states have to ensure that their laws and regulations applicable to online world and to intermediaries effectively safeguard human rights and fundamental freedoms of their users. But also, internet intermediaries have a very similar responsibility to conform to these standards. And so we have got, principles such as transparency, oversight, effective remedies, all of these being key to human rights compliant content moderation on the platforms. To end my presentation, I would just go to the next slide, and I will end it with COVID, and perhaps with a bit of a warning or recapitulation of everything that I have said. There can be exceptional circumstances, as we have seen with COVID last year, that can justify exceptional measures, including certain restrictions on freedom of expression that otherwise would not be permissible. But they should never be used as a pretext for silencing critical voices. And there will always be safeguards that have been developed by the European Court of Human Rights that need to remain firmly in place. And to that end, last year, our Secretary General has also prepared a toolkit for states, which you can consult on our website, on the impact of COVID-19 on freedom of expression and how it should be tackled and addressed by the states. So all of the instruments that I was talking about, you can find on the website of the Information Society Department, which is well documented on the next and my last slide. Here you go. If you want to read or hear more about our standards, the research that we do, events, you can always, of course, check us out here. So thank you very much.
Дуже дякую, Урсі, за таку ґрунтовну, детальну презентацію.
Thank you very much, Ursa, for this comprehensive presentation. It's really very interesting. We have a number of questions from the participants. I could read one of the questions, or maybe Christina wants to do that. Maybe she wants to proceed to questions and answers. Okay, a question from Vitaly Tkachenko. If disinformation is intentionally disseminated, that's quite clear. But if the media disseminate disinformation, but they do not have information saying that this is disinformation, can one apply to rebroadcasters the legal sanctions? Is the question to Ushka.
Right. I hope I have unmuted myself. So if I understand correctly, if there is accidental mistake on the part of the media and they disseminate this information without knowing that they do so, indeed, media have a lot of legal and ethical obligations. And of course, providing responsible journalism, meaning one that values accuracy and reliability above all, would be the basic precept of journalism. So, of course, absolutely. First of all, if media are alerted by somebody to this, to such an accident, they should first and foremost already act by and of themselves. But there is, of course, in many legislations also the right to reply or correction. And these kind of legal institutes can also be used, of course, if the media are not, let's say, by themselves responsible or enough, or indeed, if they consider that they have not made such a mistake. So yes, there are always certain legal instruments that can be used to the effect of correcting, rectifying inaccuracies. Now, of course, that will be more difficult if we're talking about some, huge disinformation campaign with really serious consequences. Obviously, in such a case, a simple rectification might not always be necessary. That is why one of the things in the information disorder report that is also advised is for the media to also use their power and their voice and then their opinion-making legitimacy to educate people about disinformation, to write original stories about disinformation campaigns, and to try to debunk them.
Thank you. We will have more time for Q&As at the end of the day. We will be able to discuss this more in detail. Thank you very much, Ushka, for your presentation. I'm giving the floor to Kristina Rozgoni for the session about the government's responses about the response of the European Union, where we're going here. Jurgis Vilčinskas and Tanel Tang. Kristina, please.
Thank you so much. And I also wish to share with you that we are collecting questions received on the different platforms, in the chat, on Facebook, all over, and we are going to have a separate session at the very end whereby our speakers could respond to like a bouquet of questions. So no question will be left unanswered. But at this moment, I would wish to welcome our speakers on addressing the European Union's responses to countering disinformation. So first, thank you so much for Jurgi Vilčinskas, the second Deputy Head of Division at the European External Action Service, who is going to talk about the European Union's journey into the world of responding and countering disinformation. And we also had welcome Tanel Tang, who is the member of support group for Ukraine at the European Commission. So the floor is yours, and we would wish to learn more about this journey, the EU action against disinformation that has started several years back, at least we should say in 2015, and the experiences of the EU are of utmost importance to us today. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kristina, a lot. I hope you can hear me. Welcome, big welcome to everybody from Brussels. It's great to see so many people still on the call, despite lunchtime break in Kiev. We agreed with my colleague Tanel, who is from European Commission, and I'm from European External Action Service, that we will try to basically to give you a little bit of crash course on European responses to disinformation, and also touch base on how we can better together with Ukraine address this issue. We will try to be very telegraphic because we want to keep, more time for the questions and the comments from your side. Now, I would start maybe by saying, that disinformation, if we look at and analyze it at European Union level, is still a very low-risk activity, relatively cheap, and unfortunately has quite a high impact on our societies. And it's also very much, as previous speaker said, it's very much a morphing phenomenon, right? So we're dealing with something where, with something where techniques are changing very quickly, where we have a lot of new state and non-state actors coming in on this stage, and using this information as a sort of hybrid warfare tool. We have a lot of new things every day appearing, in terms of how to, let's say, deceive and trick the online platforms, to spread your message virally over there. So basically, we are in a very difficult, let's say, catch-up game where we have a lot of sort of first movers, not constrained, by bureaucracies, not constrained by procedures, willing, for political or economic gains to attack our societies. So the issue, the real issue, is how we protect our democracies, And I think first step in our response is to define the problem. And it is still very confusing, because we see in policy responses that people get confused, really, distinguishing illegal from legal, organic dissemination of harmful information from intentional, which is where we should be looking at. Understanding all kind of the emerging threats that are all there. So this is the first thing. Identify define the problem, because without defining the problem, you cannot really define the policy response properly. The second thing I would say, which is very important in response, is get rid of this assumption that governments can solve it, that governments sort of have a silver bullet, to introduce the laws, regulations, bans, whatever, to tackle disinformation or influence operations. I mean, governments certainly have a very important role to play in response, because governments have, the ability to plan strategically. They have budgets, to put behind. But the response have to be really, really encompassing, basically putting together, the academic community, fact checkers, online platforms, so basically the private sector, into one community of response. Now, I mean, in European Union, of course, we tried, let's say, different policy responses, and I mean, Christina mentioned already. We kind of we already back in 2015 had basically a special team in the External Action Service taking a look and challenging, in particular, pro-Kremlin disinformation. But from there, we moved on. We worked on several policy documents, and the one which we designed at the very end of 2018, Action Plan Against Disinformation, it outlined several pillars of response. And I hope you can see it in the screen in front of you. Let's say the 5 pillars where we see EU response could be the strongest. Now, the first and obvious pillar was basically to have an ability to understand, to track the narratives, harmful narratives that are out there, and to understand the actors, who are building disinformation campaigns. After that stage, of course, the other very important thing is basically to connect different people out there who want to respond to disinformation campaigns. And, we realized that even between the member states of the European Union, we had difficulties, in approaching this issue in the same way. So what we did is basically we created a platform, if you like, a community of experts, which we call a rapid alert system, to basically link up all the capitals with EU institutions and work together day by day on looking what are the threats and discussing how to address some of these disinformation campaigns. The other thing, which is obvious, needs to be part of response, is the campaigns to raise awareness about about the fact that people are being manipulated, you know, on the online platforms, before elections, after elections, you know, in all kind of different ways. And actually, we decided in the External Action Service actually to run a permanent awareness raising campaign, which we call EU versus Disinfo, which has its website, its social media accounts, where we basically on a weekly basis expose concrete, let's say, concrete cases of disinformation. And for that, we have a public database of these disinformation cases. We have quite a lot of visitors, you know, in our website, and we of course publish our content in different languages. So it's not only the Europeans, but also it's people, you know, in the Eastern Partnership countries learn more about how we tackle disinformation. So this awareness sort of building part is really important, and I hope we can do also much more on this part together with Ukrainians. And then the other thing, of course, we looked, you know, how we can build our own strategic communication capacities. So basically, for example, have proper communication campaigns, you know, let's say, having our own narrative in societies, and very often, let's say, pre-banking, not only debunking, but pre-banking some of these harmful disinformation narratives. Now it's 2020, of course, we moved a little bit from, let's say, our approach in 2018. And December last year was quite important because in the European Union, we launched two big policy documents. One is called European Democracy Action Plan. The other is called Digital Services Act, where we outlined, you know, our, let's say, next generation thinking on how we want to counter foreign interference and how we want to counter disinformation. I mean, action plan is called action plan for the good reason, because it has very specific, let's say, actions in it. And what we're doing now, together with the partners across the EU capitals, but also some of the international partners like G7, like NATO, we are looking into basically into the ways to impose higher costs on those perpetrators who actually try to, you know, to attack us. So we are basically trying to look at the toolbox, if you like, which can be used then by our member states, national level, European level, to tackle disinformation. We also look basically how to get better, you know, in our crisis communications. So, you know, how to have a very flexible, quick, you know, means to react in the situations where we basically see a very well coordinated, very viral disinformation attack on us. And at the same time, we still have to build, you know, capacities at the level of EU member states, where we need basically, you know, to train public communicators, where we need also to, for example, to liaise with national media, with the fact-checking community, again, kind of to build this, if you like, united action against the perpetrators. So that's a little bit maybe the sort of the feel, just to give you the feel what is out there in terms of you know, response means. And here, of course, I'm not touching at all the work that is being rolled out at the European Union level linked to the online platforms, because I understand then that the next session of this workshop will be dedicated in particularly for that, because this is another big block, you know, of our activities. So to summarize, no silver bullet, I mean, of course, in terms of response, but European Union has quite a number of policy initiatives on that. European Parliament politically is very much behind this work. We look at it as a very much, as a kind of hybrid threat in a broader context, also, where hacks and leaks kind of also very often play part in disinformation campaigns. And we very much look, forward to work with other partners, including Ukraine, to invest in this work, to scale it up, and to learn from each other. So, Christina, I stop over here, and I will pass then the floor to Tanel to focus maybe on particular EU-Ukraine cooperation projects.
Before we give the floor, we have received already a question which probably you would be the best to answer. So maybe I think this would be a great opportunity also for you to give an example on how the EU response works. So the question regards the EU disinfo, basically the repository on disinformation and the registry on disinformation attempts and attacks against the EU. And the question was raised about a Dutch case back in 2017 and 18, and that a Dutch media outlet was basically registered as a threat to with regards to EU disinformation. And later it turned out, according to the question, that the assessment was erroneous. So the question raises several critical aspects on the basis of which, so what the criteria is on the basis of which the EU versus disinfo specialists evaluate content and conclude that the material contains disinformation. So the criteria of identification, as you put forward, would be one of the questions we would need to get a better understanding how it works. And the other very important question is about how to basically appeal such a decision. So what are the mechanisms for reconsidering such classification of certain media outlets and of news information? Thank you.
Indeed, Christina. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think we are not, let's see, we are not fact-checking institution, right? Because we are sponsored by the government, right? We are not independent fact-checkers. We are neither. We basically, what we do in our activities, we focus not on the messenger but on the message, right? So when we look at the disinformation narratives, we employ a wide range of tools. So we monitor specific, let's say, media. And of course, when we talk about EU versus disinfo campaign, it is awareness raising campaign. Of course, we very much focus, on pro-Kremlin ecosystem, right? Media, alternative media, that is also linked to that ecosystem. And we very much look, at the narratives and the messages that they are putting out there. We see, if there is harmful information, clearly false information, clearly artificially, being amplified, in order to be spread virally, then of course, we try to expose it, so we publish articles about it. We put these concrete examples in our public database. And of course, if there are, let's say, if we make errors of judgment, or of course there is always an opportunity on our website to flag to us, to file us the complaint, to flag the case, and we immediately will look at it, and if we find it right, I mean, we'll remove it. So it's a very quick reactive mechanism. But I propose that we go to Tanel now, because his presentation sort of is a part of what we both agreed, and then maybe we can take questions afterwards.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So Tanel, the floor is yours.
Good early afternoon, colleagues. And Christina, very happy to see you as well. Recall our last discussions in Kiev. Lots of things have changed since then. Some definitely towards positive, and some maybe not so positive. Let's put it this way. No, I think that what I would like to touch upon is our engagement with Ukraine in this area. My colleague Remy Duflo, the deputy head of mission, already had a very good and extensive introductory statement. But what I would like to stress is that any kind of discussion what the EU does in the area of countering disinformation in Ukraine starts with this solidarity aspect that Ukraine is under a very severe hybrid attack, and of course disinformation plays a very important part of this. So any kind of support, any kind of action, any kind of statement has to start with this. And then also a very important other element is that Ukrainian government and Ukrainian civil society and media is very interested to engage with the EU on this topic. Jurgis knows it very well as well through his work in the East Stratcom. Very much looking forward for further cooperation with East Stratcom, with European Commission, and also with obviously with the EU delegation who represents us on the ground. Now, what we have done, we have established a very special forum for discussing those issues. We call it informal working group for strategic communication, which meets both at the high level and at the expert level. By the way, the expert level discussion just will take place tomorrow. And this is basically a forum where we coordinate our positions, where a forum that should inform our capacity building and other support, and also a forum to share the developments both on EU and the Ukrainian side. I should also say that that this cooperation that we have with Ukraine in this area is very much built on the new framework of the Eastern Partnership communication, and obviously building resilience against disinformation is a very important component there. Now, a little bit about our support. Basically, we have 3-4 main strands how we support Ukraine in this area. I think the first and very important branch is the support to independent media. And this is a joint value of Ukraine and EU, which we have enshrined in the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, and obviously share this throughout our action. And independent media is something we support through different tracks. We work together with the Council of Europe in ensuring the stable media environment. We support public service broadcaster. Independence of public service broadcaster is very important for EU. In this context also, I maybe should stress that the current discussions on selecting the head of the supervisory board of the public service broadcaster is something we follow very closely. And then also the independent media at the local level. So as much as possible to go and support through grants independent media outlets throughout the country. Now, second main thread, if I may put it this way, is the capacity building support to the Ukrainian government. And this is also through different means. We engage with a close dialogue with different ministries. We are engaged in supporting their communication campaigns. Also, we try to find out the main disinform narratives in some EU member states against Ukraine. We are just about to launch a contract on this. And then also the capacity by the local and regional actors to and government to respond to disinformation. Raul Rebane, the expert from Estonia, will speak later about the Estonian experience. He's working with one of the projects that is being led by the Estonian Eastern Partnership Center and focuses particularly to the Azov Sea region. And then the third thread is communicating about EU-Ukraine cooperation and our support. Some of you may have heard, seen our Moving Forward Together campaign. And this is obviously important in highlighting the support that the EU is giving, but also the close partnership between Ukraine and the EU. And we are now in the process of launching the second generation of the communication campaign, which hopefully will be running as of late spring this year. I think I will maybe close the short intervention by saying that we can definitely do more. I think that an area which we have to explore is how to use our media and civil society support to support those organizations who on the grassroots level deal with countering disinformation, and we actually have plans to step up our support in this area. So for this reason, this discussion today and obviously if there are questions would be very useful for me and for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And also thank you for complementing each other in such a great way. I am looking at the chat, whether we have received direct questions related to this panel. But meanwhile, I would kindly ask both of you to put forward maybe a few, one or two very specific examples which you consider as being the biggest achievements of the task force, of the EU support. So what do you consider as the biggest achievement in that sense, and maybe particularly and specifically with regards to the cooperation between the EU and Ukraine, which support action proved to be the most successful as of today?
Maybe I can start a little bit, in terms of what we consider our biggest achievements tackling disinformation, right? And well, I think there are many areas you could focus, right? I think we were quite successful in raising awareness about mis and disinformation around the COVID-19 pandemic. We were, for example, publishing specific reports from the ES side. They were very well taken, noticed by international media. So, we basically put a finger, pointing out that, in such cases when we have not only pandemic, but also infodemic, real lives are at stake. So, we really have, to take a little bit of collective action, not only at the government side, but at the online platform side as well to fix this issue. And I think we were good, in bringing this agenda forward. Then I think the other thing, that we did quite successfully before European Parliament elections was basically working together with the media. with journalists across 13 member states, also raising awareness about how disinformation campaigns are developed, how disinformation spread, how best is to react, in these situations. So basically trying to look at different innovative, creative ways together with the member states how to protect elections. But of course, disinformation doesn't stop, or is sort of trending not only around elections. It's a kind of, overall challenge. So you have to keep up with the pace. And in particular, last year we developed a set of simulations, for public communicators in different member states, training the people to basically to be able to react, when their governments or their embassies, attacked, and what they should do, how they should react, how they should be aware of situation. So there are a lot of sort of different, let's say, areas in where we try to be active, try to partner options, because now there are so many strong organizations on detection side. We definitely, governments are not the strongest in detecting, for example, disinformation on the online platforms. So we always have to partner up with these actors. And then the last thing to mention is strategic communication campaigns. So we have these campaigns in our priority countries, which is Ukraine, which is Georgia, which is Moldova, but also Western Balkan countries, also Middle East and North Africa countries, where, for example, we built a very successful campaign on Syria sanctions. So this is, basically the work to put your own strategic narrative out there, to be visible and to have a voice. But I pass now to Tunnel in terms of, assessing what works best, in terms of Ukrainian, let's say, work strand.
Thank you so much. So, Tanner, the question for you is which support action in the framework of the EU-Ukrainian cooperation would you consider as the biggest success or the biggest achievement so far?
I think I would broaden it maybe a little bit more as support and dialogue, and maybe list 3 elements. I think first point is the fact that Ukraine, despite of this very difficult situation that I described earlier, has preserved a very diverse and rich media space. Lots of media outlets, online, TV, radio. So this is something which is, to me, this is exceptional. Also, when you compare the situation in other Eastern Partnership countries and in the EU neighborhood more broadly. And I mean, for us, of course, this is important because we have the association agreement, and association agreement very clearly states this joint commitment to the freedom of expression and media. I think second point, maybe the link is not obvious, but public service broadcaster and the independence of it, and also the fact that that the public service broadcaster has, for this year, first time in its history, received the full funding as foreseen by the law. And this is something that we have been promoting since the creation of the public service broadcaster, and this outlet and independence of this outlet is important, extremely important in this very, I would say, difficult media landscape and also the big waves of disinformation. I think also the studies show that it is the most reliable media channel when it comes to the independent information and objective coverage of political events. So I think, to me, also we have been involved to our statements, through our let's say rhetorical support, but also direct support, which we will be stepping up shortly. And then the third element is something that Jurgis mentioned earlier, and this is the strategic communication campaigns, and earlier our communication, what we did in Ukraine was very fragmented. We did basically one project, a communication campaign, another project. But now what we have really tried to do is to bring this under one strategic roof, and also created a brand for communicating in Ukraine. So I think this is something that also it's interesting for the other countries, not only Eastern Partnership countries, but other countries to follow. Over.
Thank you so much. Our time is up, so we are handing over to the next panel, and thank you again for the very informative and very important insights you have provided, and any questions that we receive later on to any of the panels, we will give the floor for answers at the very end at the Q&A session. So thank you, and now the floor is given over to Taras and the next panel on government's responses. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.
Дякую. І наступна...
Thank you. And our next session, session 4, is government's responses to disinformation on social media platforms. We have here 3 very cool speakers who will tell us about the experience of Sweden, Germany, and Estonia. And first, I would like to give the floor to Mikael Toffesson, head of Counter-Information Influence Section, the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be here in Kiev. The last time I was in Kiev was in 2018 in December, when I visited your beautiful town together with Tanel Tang in the previous panel, and we were talking about the protection of elections. Unfortunately, I'm not physically with you. I'm in Stockholm, but mentally I'm right here. And I would ask you to put up my first slide, if you could. Thank you. And mind you, I do not speak Ukrainian, so you will have to excuse me if I get off the track now and then. I come from the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, which is also abbreviated MSB. We work with crisis management, civil defense. We develop rescue service capabilities. We work with cybersecurity, and we have the task to identify and counter information influence activities targeting Sweden. And I would like to talk a bit about our work here. Next slide, please. In Sweden, we've had a long history actually of psychological defense, how to prepare our population against psychological warfare. We've been doing this for almost 70 years now. But during the 1990s and up until the Russian invasion of Crimea, psychological defense was not a priority for us. But since then, of course, it has been. And since 2016, we have had in our appropriation for our agency that we have to have a good capability to identify and counter foreign information influence activities targeting Sweden. And we are also the agency that is tasked to support other agencies, so they have this capability, and any other state entity actually. So we identify and counter foreign influence activities, and we help others to do this. And for us, foreign information influence activities is when you use any kind of information so that it will have a negative effect on our national security objectives. For instance, if you use information so it will have a negative effect on the safety and security of our population, or on our functionality of our society, or a negative effect on our fundamental values. For instance, freedom of speech, individual rights. And for us, it has to be foreign disinformation and deception or propaganda. I have been responsible for these activities since 2014 at our agency. And during 2018 and 2019, I was head of our agency task force to protect Sweden national election and the EU election against foreign influence. Next panel, please. Slide, please. Not next panel. So we are going to talk a bit about government responses to disinformation on social media platforms. So I'll talk a bit about first the Swedish social media environment. 89% of the Swedish population use social media. And on the slide here, you can see the major platforms that people use. And Facebook is, of course, the biggest one. More or less everyone use it. The Swedish information space, we're only 10 million people, so it's fairly small. This means that a majority of the population is connected to each other through social media. And therefore, it's easy to reach a large part of our society from your keyboard. Social media is important to our open society, and it creates a connection between our population, journalists, decision makers, and politicians. At the same time, it's a problematic vector for disinformation. And we can see this actually, that the foreign state-controlled news media and social media accounts use social media platforms to proliferate, to spread their narratives, and to try to whitewash the provenance of the disinformation, and actually where the disinformation comes from. And what we see is also that they try to engage alternative media channels and discussion groups in social media. So, and that goes for left or right or any political value. So therefore, our agency, we have a close dialogue with most of the social media companies. We discuss threats, risks, vulnerabilities, and they explain how they act against disinformation to us. We also have a possibility to quickly inform them about ongoing operations, and we will then hand over to them to decide how to act against behavior that goes against their policies. But ultimately, we see it as our task to support our population, media, and the government authorities to counter disinformation on the social media environment. And the social media platforms are important partners, but it is the population that we are protecting when we do this. Next slide. What have we learned so far doing this? Well, foreign aggressive influence campaigns are about lying and deceiving. We're not talking about facts and objective information here. It's about lying and deceiving. And therefore, it only works when there is a lack of, first, awareness that there is a threat, and awareness that we have vulnerabilities. When we lack coordination, cooperation, and communication. In other words, we need to be able to warn each other when we see influence activities, and we need to support each other to counter these activities. And finally, we also need capability, knowledge, methods, and resources to identify and counter disinformation. Another important fact when it comes to disinformation and the information environment is that in a democracy, the leaders need the trust and the support of the population. Otherwise, eventually, they will be voted out. An antagonist, the aggressor, can therefore not only target the leaders. They also have to target the population and the leaders at the same time. That means that they have to actually show themselves, because they need to reach out to the population and the leaders. And this, as we see it, is preferably done by reaching outlets where these groups are exposed. And where do we have our population, and where do we have our leaders? We have them in traditional media as consumers. We have them in social media platforms. We can see them through diplomacy, through advertising and other mass media outlets. So, what do we do about this? Next slide. We have organized a team at our agency to identify and counter foreign influence activities. And I would just like to highlight how we work with this and how we are organized. First of all, we have a research and development team. These are the enablers who will support the other branches with the directing research, directing training, directing exercises. And so they are the support team. But then we have a threat analysis. And their job is to identify foreign threat activities. And of course, we prioritize Russia, China, and actually Islamist organizations. They try to identify the organization and the intent of the aggressor. And we also have then another team, which we call operational response. And this team, their job is actually to come up with action plans when we see an attack, and when that will also help us to find the right methods to respond to an attack. And they work very close with the threat analysis. So we see things and we respond. But I would say that the most important part of our team is the resilience team. Their job is to identify vulnerabilities in key areas of our society and mitigate them. Because the most effective way to counter disinformation is actually mitigating vulnerabilities. When you're under an attack, you're probably too late. You will be led by the conflict. But if you can create resilience, the attacker will not have an effect. So what we do is to actually look at vulnerabilities in the following sectors: agencies and authorities, government agencies and authorities, regional and local governments and authorities, traditional media, social media, and the election administration. So we support them increasing their capabilities and mitigating vulnerabilities. And how do we do this? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, awareness is important. So we've trained 14,500 civil servants and civil society members in how to identify and counter disinformation. We've had training and tabletop exercises for civilian total defense agencies in countering disinformation. We have distributed a handbook for communicators, and this one is available on our website. And we've had special trainings in this handbook for 450,000 civil servants. We also cooperate with Journalist Training Media Institute, an academic institution for continued training of accredited journalists. And that training is built on the handbook also. And finally, also to create resilience and awareness, we are being available and transparent to news media about our work, the threats, and our national vulnerabilities. And this is to reach out to the population. And we did this since media plays an important role in investigating the government and all other public administration in the nation. Media is independent of government control, which makes them a trusted narrator among the population. So our idea is actually, we have nothing to hide, but the antagonists do. So transparency is our friend and their enemy. And that's why we try to reach out through media and not be the narrator ourselves about what we do. Civil society is also important for building resilience. Through civil society, our population can be trained and educated about our fundamental values and rights. An educated population is more resilient against disinformation. Finally, we work with cooperation. And we've set up a concept we call National Operational Forum. And this concept is activated before major events, such as elections, or if we see a higher level of vulnerability in our society. For instance, now during COVID-19. In a national operational forum, we gather agencies and authorities with the central responsibility to protect against foreign threats, or with the responsibility to support critical societal functions. So we did this during the general elections in 2018, where we gathered the election authority, the counties and the municipalities, and the tax authority on one side of the table. And then on the other side of the table, we had the security police, the national police, and our agency. And there we could share information about vulnerabilities and threats. So finally, these were some examples of how it works. So we can go to the last slide, please. And next slide, please. Thank you. As we see it, what we need are the capabilities of awareness about the threat and our vulnerabilities, to be able to cooperate and collaborate, and your own capability to identify and counter disinformation. The problem is that this is a whole of society approach from the aggressor. So we need to have a team effort and whole of society approach when we defend ourselves. So, and transparency is an important tool in our toolbox, because the aggressor tried to hide their activities of disinformation, and we have nothing to hide. Reach out to media, civil society, and population is also something you have to have in your mindset. And all these activities together with transparency, team effort, and reach out, that creates trust among the population. And trust is not something you can take for granted. It's something that is given. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Дякую. Надзвичайно цікавий.
That was an extremely interesting experience to hear. And I propose to listen to other presentations and then to look at the questions which we might get by the time. And the following speaker is Simon Kreis, who is the head of the steering group for Stratcom in the Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Germany. So, Mr. Kreis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Taras. It's really a big pleasure for me to be here at this conference and to have the opportunity to share some of the experiences that we in Germany made during the last few years when it comes to tackling external disinformation. I work for the Federal Foreign Office, which is our foreign ministry, and in that capacity, obviously, we only deal with disinformation that sort of arrives in Germany from abroad, so is being spread by external, be it state or non-state actors. We do not specifically deal with disinformation coming from domestic sources, but I will explain later how we cooperate with other entities and other institutions on a national level to include domestic actors in that picture. I would also like to congratulate Michael again for the very impressive approach that Sweden has developed over the last few years. It's a big source of inspiration for us, and we are a frequent user of the Communicator's Handbook and other materials. And I must say that our own approach in Germany, I believe, is still less elaborate than yours, but I'm still willing to share what I can share here with the participants in this conference. I should add at the very beginning that I'm not an expert on Ukraine, unfortunately. I have never been to Ukraine yet. I believe it's something that is still on my list.
You should come.
Whenever it's possible again, I believe, to board a plane, I will do so and come over. So thank you very much. I believe many of the speakers before me have already clarified what is being understood under the term of disinformation and have differentiated it from pure misinformation. We'll just very quickly say that for us, disinformation has a clear intent to manipulate or distort or otherwise influence societies or democratic processes. So it's not the pure misinformation, the unintentional spreading of false information. Like in Sweden, but I believe in many other countries, the volume of disinformation has increased over the last few years. We looked at a survey from 2018 conducted by Eurobarometer for the European Union, and we saw that more than 2/3 of the populations encounter disinformation about at least once a week or almost every day. So it is obviously a very pressing issue that we all face and where we work together closely in order to counter this phenomenon. I believe it already has been mentioned a few times this morning that disinformation was also on the rise during the last year in the surroundings of the COVID-19 pandemia, which actually made it to an infodemia. And Jürges has already elaborated on this. We actually sit in a very similar boat, I believe, with all of you when it comes to disinformation around this phenomenon. And we also witnessed that a lot of disinformation around COVID-19 did not exclusively stem from domestic sources, but was originating from external sources. And we actually still face the same problem while we speak today. I would, in the sense of experience sharing, just say a few words about the approach that we in Germany on a national level are following when it comes to disinformation. Our approach is deeply set in the European approach along the lines that have been developed in the European Plan of Action Against Disinformation of 2018, and together with the EU and EU member states partners, we have developed this further over the last few years. So one pillar, obviously, in dealing with disinformation is, first of all, to detect it. And as others have explained, this is a somewhat difficult task for governments alone. It's very cumbersome and is not mainly a primary task for governments. So like others, we also rely on the findings of fact checkers from civil society. So we have contacts to fact checkers, but we do not have a very standing, let's say, cooperation with them. We just consume their findings, but we do not in any way influence their work, because in many cases, at least in Germany, fact checkers are independent journalists, and they need to maintain this independence from government. So in order to sort of fill this void, we invest in social media monitoring capabilities and strive at being able to detect disinformation ourselves. But as I said, this is a difficult endeavor, and we are maybe only 1/3 along the way in of reaching this goal. The other pillar, and that again fills part of this void, is that we cooperate very closely with international partners on mainly EU level, but also within the framework of the G7 and NATO. And there are some related cooperation formats on counter-foreign interference and so on, where we also participate, and we gather information about ongoing disinformation campaigns also from these sources. Jurgis has mentioned the rapid alert system that was established on EU level. We find that this is very helpful in order to exchange information on disinformation, but we have a similar exchange network also on a G7 level with the rapid response mechanism. Has a very similar name to the European forum. This proves to be extremely helpful. I mentioned at the beginning that we in the Foreign Office only look at external actors, and I believe we look at very similar actors as many of you. We look at one of your neighbors in Ukraine, but we also look further east to China, and we look at a few other actors, mainly from the Middle East. And we look at non-state actors. But obviously, and I believe this holds true for all our societies, much disinformation happens within national borders and is being spread by domestic actors. And that is why we have a very close interagency cooperation on national federal level. this works along the lines of a number of working groups. There's one on hybrid threats, and under this sort of overarching working group, we have experts groups. One is on resilience building, one is on scenario planning, and then we from the Foreign Office co-chair a group on tackling disinformation together with our friends from the Federal Press and Information Office. We see that many of the disinformation items that come up nationally are actually influenced or inspired by international actors. So there seems to be a lot of cooperation going on between extremist actors in Germany, with actors from abroad, and this really is a very clear recommendation to not only work with one government entity on these issues, but between agencies to really look at this phenomenon from all angles that are necessary and relevant. I would also like to say that the picture is being complemented again on European level by efforts to regulate disinformation and related phenomena online. We have seen the code of conduct, a self-regulatory mechanism that was established, I believe, again in 2018 or at the beginning of 2019. This has been assessed and will now form sort of the basis of endeavors that are in the making. On the one side, in the framework of the so-called European Democracy Action Plan, which was presented by the EU Commission in December of last year, and also in the framework of the so-called Digital Services Act, which was presented again by the EU Commission also in December in the draft version, and I believe will form the basis of discussions on European level and maybe also on a transatlantic level for the next year or year and a half. The main goal of these regulatory efforts is to get hold of online disinformation or other harmful content without really tackling the content itself, but looking at the mechanisms how disinformation is spread. This is very important because we do not want to establish any sort of censorship online, which is exactly the reason why we do not focus on the content, but on distribution mechanisms. The Digital Services Act, or the draft version that we have seen, foresees the establishment of independent oversight bodies, and I believe this is very important to again stress that these will be independent from any state or government interference. And then I would quickly like to mention the fourth pillar of our approach against disinformation, and that is resilience building in a way along the lines that Michael has drawn. Again, we in the Foreign Office do not deal with these efforts on a national level inside of Germany, but we help international partners to reach societal resilience against disinformation by funding projects and by exchanging information and experiences. Since 2015, we have been very active in the 3 Baltic states, and we will now increase our efforts in the Western Balkan states and try to build media or improve media and news literacy there. I should just quickly mention that the issue of disinformation is a very topical one for Germany, as we are at the beginning of a super election year, as it's being called here. We have elections on national, federal level and on subnational, regional levels. I believe all in all 6 of them. That is why we will deepen our cooperation both internationally and nationally in order to deal with disinformation. Last but not least, and that already has been mentioned by a few speakers, we, and that is also being done within my unit, we conduct strategic communication campaigns in order to get our own narrative across and to set actually a very positive tone and to maybe limit the space that disinformers could use for spreading their disinformative narratives. We also try to weaken the brand of disinformation. And maybe a very last word before I come to an end. We on a national government level have decided that we do not automatically debunk false or misinformation or disinformation because of the well-known negative psychological effects, which does not preclude us from debunking in individual cases where we deem that this is necessary. But we have no automatism in debunking. So I would leave it with that, and I would like to thank you very much for this opportunity and also for your attention.
Thank you, Simon.
And now I'd like to give the floor to the 3rd speaker, and then I hope we will have some more time for questions and answers. Raul Rebane, Council of Europe consultant from Estonia, and I hope we will hear more about the Estonian experience. Raul?
Thank you. Thank you. You know, I always laugh when I hear Swedes saying that Sweden is a small country with 10 million. What we should say with our 1.3 million, we are not existing. So, but what can we contribute with our 1.3 million to this big battle of information? You know, I start with our experience last month, how disinformation works. And it's quite direct thing. You know, as we know that in Russian media, especially in TV, there has been a lot of information that European vaccines against COVID, they are not working. And the only working vaccine is Sputnik. The result is obvious. Yesterday's research showed that we have approximately 30% of Russian population, Russian-speaking population, and teachers in different schools, especially in Eastbourne and Narva town and Tallinn. There are schools where only 15% of Russian-speaking teachers want to have vaccine European. They wait for Sputnik. It means that big part of teachers will be not vaccinated, and it's direct threat to society. And this is real thing. Now, how Estonia fights against disinformation? as I said, 1.3 million. It's absolutely no way to fight back with, I don't know, TV channels, books, entertainment in Russian language, whatever. We have to find some other way. Some other way. Being small is sometimes useful, which means that we can be fast, like little boat and not a big tanker. And I have to say that our strategy is quite idealistic, and it's not based on a tough methods. It's even not possible. And it's based on the three pillars. One is big understanding of democracy. It's media freedom. To fight, to have the free media is fight for life. We are very happy to be at the moment 14th in the world on a media freedom index, which means that in 30 years from Soviet Union, actually we were 11th, but we dropped 3 places. We had last 2 years in our government, right-wing, not media-loving party, but they are now from January out. So I think we restore our place. And this is big thing, really. We take very painfully every attack against media freedom, and it works. The second is, as I said, quite idealistic, is civil society. Civil society, there is no better defense against information attack than a proud citizen. Thousands, tens of thousands, NGOs, whatever they do, singing, dancing, and have their meetings. They discuss what's going on in society, and in a way they fight back. The third is like in Sweden, understanding of psychological defense. I will show our structure a little bit later. But this was in the beginning. We started 2008 to work out our structure, and now it's becoming more popular. In the beginning, media was against it, and then society was against it. They thought that it's some kind of fight against media freedom, but it was not. And now it's quite common understanding in society. So to understand what we have to do, we have to understand what are the threats. And I would like to show the Russian strategy today against Estonia. And I think, first slide, please. Or I can put it myself. Okay. Russian strategy, and I think it's quite similar in a lot of countries. Now please, at the first slide. There are different interpretations of history, and we are always in the trouble to understand or to fight back what happened in 1940. Was it liberation? So go further with the slide. Yeah. Different interpretations of history, fake information. I explained this COVID thing. There is some political parties are more supported. Economic pressure, which means that, I don't know, they will close down some transit from another port. Ethnic minorities. Lavrov attacked yesterday in a press conference with the Finnish foreign minister again that we are discriminating Russian minority. Cyber wars, and what is quite important and understanding, we should understand this, that the breaking national myth. Let's go further with let's put up to them. National myth. And your minister said that you try to do in Ukraine the positive narratives of Ukraine, and it's actually a real thing. Finnish writer Sophie Oksanen said once that if people don't know that you exist, they don't notice when you disappear. So every country must have their positive story. And here we can give example to the world. In the beginning of 90s, we tried to find out which are the most unknown countries in Europe, and we got 3 of them: Estonia, Latvia, and Slovakia. Nobody knew that we exist, and we had no stories at all. At the moment, within 20 years, we are some kind of e-country, e-government, e-elections, all these kind of things, very fast moving, and so on. Story is actually quite good. And to defend national myth is very important. At the moment, we are under attack almost every day, especially in YouTube. This is very powerful tool in the Russian language community. I counted altogether 18 basic attacking points against Baltics. There are that we have the we are extremely poor. We don't have. We are in some kind of Eurotopia. There is no way out here, and we have Russophobic, and the very special word is made about us is Baltic Vumirats. Vumirats, it means dying out, that we are dying out very soon. And there are a lot of stories about us dying out. I don't think it's true. And there are several, I don't know, tens, maybe hundreds of stories with a lot of audience that we go back to Moscow on a knees. This is somehow very important, that we are going back to knees, begging to take us back. But it's all about Baltics, and these stories are really powerful, and it's every day hundreds, maybe thousands of stories about this. Let's go to the next slide. And how information attack is working. And this is very important, that it's starting from people are believing a lot of nonsense. Disinformation. Let's go to the end, all this. And then it goes to the discussion, like Kurt Vonnegut says, persuasive guessing. Moral panic is a situation where people lose idealistic goals. They think everything is very bad, and they don't have common goals, which is a very bad situation for the state. And then normally is coming need for a strong hand, who is ending, like in Russia happened, Putin came. And then populists, and then election results, and then the state is changing. So this is very simple structure, and it's working everywhere, and it's working all the time. And we went through it too. So it means that understand the structure or basis of moral panic and need for strong hand. This must be measured by researchers. Let's go to the next slide. And what are the threats at the moment? I don't stop for a long time. We really need academic training for information soldiers. We need a university. This terror is developing every day. And like Sweden, we have highest defense forces in Estonia, which is very powerful tool already 20-something years. We restore now after 2 years, I think, this psychological defense courses, books. People must be educated, and about social media, the gymnasiums, universities, and so on and so on. I don't speak about the state officials. So education is very vital. And distinction must be made between information and influence operation. And this is, I think, really important. Influence operations are long-term strategic. For example, nostalgia for Soviet Union, which is the case in a lot of countries, like Estonia is hopeless, without future, temporary, blah blah blah, all these kind of things. So these are long-term operations. We are lying something. Disinformation, it's very simple. And now the last slide. And last slide is, let's go to the last slide. It's Estonian structure of psychological defense. Whatever is around, they are very much connected. In the middle are agreed values, who we are, what makes us what we are, our positive narratives, our stories. And we can't fight back, as I said, with the TV channels and so on. So Estonia doesn't have disinformation structure. We have not so far temporarily or permanently suspended TV channels of Russia. I have at home at least 200 channels in Russian language. Now there will be discussion after this COVID story. Is it okay that such lies are coming to our Russian language speaking population through channels? But at the moment, there was no suspending of Russian TV channels. Only one website has been blocked in Estonia. This was Sputnik, and not the reason of content, but the reason that the owner of Sputnik was under sanctions by European laws. So you understand the big picture. If we take the psychological defense structure in 5 countries, Sweden, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. So Estonia and Finland, we are very mild in our actions. Latvia and Lithuania have much more strict laws. We don't have such laws. And the Swedish structure has been some kind of goal to a lot of countries. And now, from last week, we have several good works about psychological defense, scientific work about psychological defense, comparison of different countries. So where life is going further, it's very difficult to say, but one is clear that being small is no way to fight back with the big power. You have to create a psychological resilient system for population, among media, among government people, and this is our way. So this is my story.
Дякую, пане Рибане.
Thank you, Mr. Riban.
I'll switch to English to ask one question. I think each of you was mentioning about positive narratives, strategic communications within general communications, and I would like to ask you how exactly these positive narratives you organize the distribution, and specifically how big or whether there is a role of government or non-governmental actions, and if government is disseminated some positive strategic narratives, how is that organized? And is there any problems with government dealing with strategic positive narratives being disseminated?
Was the question to me?
A question to everyone, but we can start with you, and I would be happy to listen to Simon as well.
Estonia started in the middle of 90s, and it was not government. it was scientists, opinion leaders, and the special role is former Estonian President Toomas Hendrik Ilves, who started a campaign so-called Estonian Tiger Leap to Information Society, which means that the plan was to computerize all schools. In 2 years, the society was very much ready to fight. In 2 years, there was a line in a state budget, Tiger Leap. In 2 years, just campaign. And later it went like very well. I mean, society took it like our way. And we were extremely lucky. I really understand the Ukrainian situation where the state is much bigger and it's much difficult to move. But without finding out what is your privilege among this competition in the world, it's extremely difficult to fight. To make people proud is, from my point of view, the biggest goal of information defense or psychological defense. And when government is part of this, it's very good. Actually, in the most time we had government as a part of this. When it's not, so the people have to do it. What happened in Estonia too.
Thank you very much. Simon, would you comment?
Yes, thank you. As I mentioned, we do conduct strategic communication campaigns, also in order to sort of spread our own narratives and take away a space from disinforming entities. And we do so on, well, basic topics of German foreign policy, such as the membership in the European Union, on the value of multilateralism and so forth. So we do not engage in a day-to-day communication on foreign policy events, but we really concentrate on these very underlying topics, and we do so by identifying, first of all, a political aim and then derive a communicative aim from that, and then look at which instruments we can use to get our messages across, who our target groups actually are. And so the campaigns that we conduct actually differ quite a lot from each other. I have to admit that I believe, as in every institution, our resources when it comes to staffing, but also financing, are limited. And this is why we have not been able to roll out campaigns like everywhere where we would like to do so. We would very much like to be more committed and more active in the Eastern neighborhood states, but so far, for example, with our Europe United campaign, it bears the hashtag Europe United, we mainly concentrate on European member states themselves and focus on those countries where maybe the European idea has been under some pressure during the last few years. And the same holds true with for our campaign on multilateralism, which was especially relevant during the years of the Trump US presidency. So yes, proactive communication is a tool against disinformation, but I believe we could do more on that front.
Thank you. And Mikael?
Yes, and first of all, well, I belong to an agency and we are bureaucrats and boring, so we don't work with the positive narratives. What we've been doing, on the other hand, is actually working very hard with facts. And for instance, we came out with a pamphlet a couple of years ago which was called In Case of Crisis or War, where we told our population, or we prepared them for the wartime environment and the crisis time environment, where we also told them that we will as a nation never give up. So any communication about us giving up is false. And that is an old strategic defense narrative that we've had since after World War II. And right now during COVID-19, instead of going against the disinformation, we have allocated enormous resources about information regarding handling of COVID-19 and also vaccination right now. So, and we're right now planning to also big disinformation campaign there. But mostly we will not talk about disinformation or debunking. We will instead getting the facts out. And a new method now is actually getting control of the information flows. So knowing the target audience and their vulnerabilities, for instance, individual fears among different groups, and then actually buying the flows in social media and targeted ads to actually reach out ahead of the disinformation actors to reach out. The only agency that has been working with defense will at the moment with the positive narrative is the armed forces in their recruitment campaigns, where they have, for instance, have pictures of Sweden and beautiful places and said, this country is worth defending and so on. We haven't come that far yet with the psychological defense. And next year, we will have a new agency for psychological defense, and my team will be transferred to that agency. And we are looking in actually also to strategic communication with positive narratives. But that's for the future.
What's the name of this agency?
It will probably be the Agency for Psychological Defense. Not so advanced, but the details regarding it hasn't come out yet. It will come in a few weeks, probably.
Taras, I would add a little bit from different angle. We are talking today with the Ukrainian people and somehow share our experience. But I would like to say that you have great experience and wonderful scientists. The role of your one scientist in Estonian information, let's say, resilience of Georgi Georgievich Potsevtsov has been huge. He visited Estonia 5 years in a row. We translated 3 of his books. He consulted a lot of our agencies, including Ministry of Foreign Affairs, special units, and so on, and government. So I really think that his part has been big. So we are so small that we have to take from others. We don't have ourselves, and we find it from Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think at this point I need to pass the floor to Christina Razgani, and we'll have some extra time for questions and responses. Thank you very much for panelists. Дякую паналістам. На цьому завершуємо сесію реагування.
So on this we're finishing the session of regulating information on social networks. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the many questions that were raised. We have tried to group the questions and try to get our speakers, our panelists, to answer them. So first, we have received a question that I believe could be best or should be best addressed and responded and answered by Tarek McGonagall on the need of legal definition of this information, whether there is a need. I remember and I recall he mentioned in his presentation that within the EU it is only Lithuania who has already incorporated in the laws the precise definition of disinformation. So either Tarlak or any of the panelists of this last panel would wish to comment on this, that would be welcomed. Also, we have, maybe we start with this question. So the potential need or the need on exact legal definition of disinformation. Anyone who would wish to respond to this session? Maybe? Or what is the German, the Estonian, or the Swedish experience in this regard? Do you have an exact, precise definition of disinformation?
I can jump in and just give the Swedish perspective here that this focusing on disinformation will not help because what we're talking about is an aggressor that will use also correct information to handle the perception of the situation. Whatever laws you make, they will adapt to and find new ways. So therefore, right now in Sweden, we're more looking at what are we willing to accept? Because we, of course, first of all, always want to protect the freedom of speech and the freedom of press. So, so if a behavior might be legal but not okay, maybe we should find other responses. So I think our perspective will probably stay out of the box and be asymmetric to the aggressor.
Thank you so much. This is a very important feature and aspect we should consider here. Anyone else who should?
I actually 100% agree with Mika. We don't have any definition.
Okay. Maybe in Germany, because the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz is very often recalled also on the one hand in the context of hate speech, but also very often in the context of disinformation. But as much as I could recall the law, there is no certain definition to disinformation, at least not in the NetzDG, but maybe in the criminal laws. So what is the German situation in this regard?
I couldn't agree with Raoul and Michael. We do not have a legislative definition of disinformation for the very same reason, and also because disinformation itself is not illegal. It's something that we find harmful and that we would rather would not exist. But it's not illegal. In most cases, it's protected by the freedom of expression and free speech. So we use other approaches against disinformation, and I try to outline them. The Network Enforcement Act that you mentioned, Christina, has a very different angle. It really only applies to illegal online content. So everything that is already illegal in the old-fashioned world, analogous world, has been sort of transferred to the digital world and is prohibited there. And there are certain methods in order to delete or flag such illegal content, be it hate speech, be it terrorist content, be it pornographic or child pornographic content, and so on. But explicitly, it does not relate to disinformation. So this nexus that is often drawn between how to tackle disinformation and the Network Enforcement Act is not correct.
Thank you so much. This is also very important because there are many, many misunderstandings about the German legislative efforts in this sense. So thank you so much for shedding light on this aspect. We have also received very important questions with regards to sanctions in the context of disinformation. And one of our participants asked whether there are mechanisms of sanctions against citizens and residents within the European Union and within the member states. So basically, whether there are sanctions and mechanisms against internal disinformation efforts. Maybe Oskar could answer this question, or anyone else who would wish to jump in would be also greatly welcomed.
Hello, Christina, and hello.
Thank you, Oskar.
To all of the participants. Perhaps just one mention with regard to the previous question. I would only say that whenever there are attempts of legislating something, so if the responses are strictly legal, then of course definitions are also very helpful and necessary. So it really very much depends which kind of responses we're talking about, and then the necessity of definition varies. But as almost none of the countries in Europe right now has this specific disinformation addressed legislation, obviously there is no need also for an exact definition. In terms of sanctions, however, well, again, because this really does come back to the question of definition, there are a number of either criminal offenses or civil law remedies that one can use for different variations of what you might call disinformation, but they wouldn't really fit. And here, for example, people often kind of confuse, hate speech related offenses with disinformation, which is why I think it is very important what Simon said about the Network Enforcement Act, because indeed, in most cases, we're not talking about new offenses. In most cases, the states responded, at least to our knowledge, with simply adaptations of their existing legislative frameworks, and are trying to embed the most dangerous and the most harmful kinds of disinformation within them. So, of course, in that case, sanctions are already existing. Now, we do see also, and we have seen in the context of COVID-19 especially, that some countries sort of moved from this established framework to some new offenses. But in fact, they were rather vague and ill-conceived. So our advice was perhaps to rethink the approach and go back to, more nuanced approaches, and really only curbing freedom of expression in cases of strict necessity.
Thank you so much. And I think this question also raises very much the point you have made about the very careful balancing act between freedom of expression, also very often freedom of the media, because as we have seen across Europe, also across the world, but unfortunately also in Europe, that these very new definitions, very new set of sanctions were actually very often used against independent media, where independent journalists, investigative media was labeled as scaremongers among the society. And I think Council of Europe had a lot to do in pointing out how worrying this trend was. So how much this balancing act is really needed to see, not to foresee the spillover effects of responding to disinformation, especially in legislative and regulatory and authoritative measures. Any?
Christina, can I react on this comments?
Thank you. Absolutely, please.
Because of course we all know. I mean, I feel a bit that elephant is in the room, and and we are not really talking about the elephant. We all know what this question is about. I mean, it was just 2 weeks ago, I think, when National Security and Defense Council in Ukraine basically imposed sanctions against 3 media channels. And I think that what we have to understand here is the fact that Ukraine is in the conflict, in the military conflict. And because of this military conflict, obviously, there are different pieces of legislation addressing the challenges. I'm not talking about media, but I'm talking in general, the protection of Ukraine from foreign aggressor. And if we take this into account, obviously there are laws on anti-terrorist operations, on national security, and it's clear that based on those laws, based on that legislation, Ukraine can take legitimate acts, and those legitimate action, I would say, legitimate action. And of course, this legitimate action may have an impact on the operation of one or the other media channel. I think this is what I want to say. The key only is that, of course, that the action that is taken is proportional to the aim that the action is supposed to address. Over.
Thank you so much. It always helps to find the elephant in the room and to point to the elephant in the room. So thank you so much. Anyone who wished to, from the panelists, to comment on this, or from the speakers? Thank you. If not, then we move on to the next question. Maybe not an easier, but definitely without an elephant. Whether there are any educational programs, curricula available in EU countries for preparing professionals on the topics raised during our sessions. Mikael, I remember that the Swedish handbook became a very important source and best practice in many public administrations. So that could be a source of education in that sense towards, as much as I understand, towards public authorities and civil servants. But other educational programs, anyone of our speakers is aware about, would be very welcome to name here.
I could mention, not actually answer your question, but one thing we are looking into, but we were not able to succeed with, was actually, I would like to see more PhD students regarding the issue of psychological defense, as we would call it in Sweden, or to counter disinformation. I think we need to have a new, how should I say, research area regarding these issues. For instance, when it comes to disinformation, some would say that source critical thinking and media and communication knowledge could be enough. But I think we need to do research about how do you think source critical when someone is lying? What are the psychology behind that? So I was hoping to actually get the first PhD student and finance that in Sweden last year, but unfortunately it got stuck in an academic debate whether this should be brought up within political science or strategic communication field. And finally we gave up with since they couldn't figure it out, we stopped our financing and hoped that they could decide this for themselves before we come back with our money. But so I would like to highlight that need, actually, that we need to research more about that. And our handbook we like, and many have used it, but I would also stress that the UK came out with a handbook called Resist. If you haven't read it, read it. It's the same researcher behind our handbook and the UK Resist handbook, but it puts it together. You get you become more strategic and practical with those two handbooks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm very much. I very much regret we don't have colleagues from Finland, for example, here, because the Finnish educational responses and exactly addressing school children, for example, how to identify this information. I've seen, I think a few days ago, a wonderful video about how to manipulate the visualization of data and how this manipulation is already taught to school children to see what is the difference between the real facts and the real data and the different manipulated graphs and visual effects on that data. So that was, I think, a very, very useful way of how to counter and how to respond to disinformation at the age of kids in schools, and to teach them how to interpret and how to critically assess this kind of disinformation effects. Thank you so much. Another question we have received on preventive measures, and I think most probably colleagues, maybe Tanel, maybe Yorgis, if you could help us to respond to this question, which is addressing basically the issue of whether there are preventive mechanisms with regards to disinformation in place in European countries or at EU level, which could identify and could counter this, sources of disinformation before dissemination of such information. This is obviously a very tricky question in terms of how to find the balance between censorship and of preventive measures, but I am pretty sure that the EU Disinfo experience has good practices on this regard. So anyone, maybe, I don't know whether you, Yorgis is still with us, or Tanel, maybe you could help us with, or anyone else from us, of our speakers.
I'm still with you, but I think Jurgis had to go to another meeting. And I must tell you honestly that this is a question that I'm not able to answer too precisely, because obviously more the area of Jurgis. I think that the references that Jurgis earlier mentioned to this, or made to this EU Disinfo website, and basically the analytics that they do and then make available to everybody. I think this is quite helpful, you know, because there are clearly, let's say, it's quite systematic how the disinfo attacks are launched, and the actors are sometimes very similar. So to one event from one event to another. So I think that this EU, I would really recommend to consult with this EU versus Disinfo website and the data and the info that is published there. Over.
Thank you so much. I think what we could agree on this issue, on this matter, in the absence of Jurgis, is that awareness raising and strategic communication campaigns are definitely among the most effective preventive measures in terms of identifying and also pointing out potential sources of disinformation in human rights aligned manner. I don't know, Oskar, do you have anything to add to this aspect, maybe?
No, I think that you coined it just perfectly. So I would really not add to anything. Also for the economy of time, perhaps just one small alert to a study that we have made on how to promote quality journalism through media and information literacy. It can be found on the Council of Europe website. We also have a dedicated webpage to media and information literacy. And we have sort of provided a few models of different media and information literacy programs that can be used. And we have also showcased some of the very successful individual projects. Also the Finnish one that you have mentioned that has been ongoing in schools for such a long time. So perhaps for inspiration, it is also possible to look at that.
Thank you so much. These are the questions I have enlisted. I don't know, Galina, Taras, I see maybe hands being raised. If you could help. Andrei, I think, raised his hand, or anyone else. Thank you.
Андрій, я так розумію, що Кристина пропонує надати слово вам.
I understand Christina suggested that you take the floor.
Алло. Всім доброго дня.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm Andriy Hilko. I'm a correspondent of the Ukrainian Literaturna Gazeta that started being published in Munich in the 60s of last century. I've written down many things, and I have two questions and proposals. First of all, as we all can see, confronting disinformation in the European Union started after the events in Ukraine. As in the nearest future, we're going to bring up about Crimea, the occupation and liberation of Donbass from the occupants. That means that we have to enhance our work to confront disinformation. So a question to the expert from Sweden. Can we use the analogy of the Davos Forum to have with you in Stockholm, for example, an annual forum to confront disinformation? Because as we see, the European countries do not even have any definitions in the European countries. Except for Lithuania, they don't have, were they the only ones to have it in their law? That's a question to you. And then as confronting disinformation means money. I have visited Strasbourg many times, and I have even lodged applications with the European Court. These are financial issues. And the mechanism of protection of human rights works in the EU because someone pays for the work of the European Court. Can one assume that there will be an annual budget for the compensation of court costs, just the court costs, to protect the freedom of speech, of expression? Because when a person comes to the court to fight disinformation, then one would have to spend thousands of hryvnias, which is a kind of a way, it's an obstacle to fight disinformation in Ukraine. Can one see such a mechanism in Europe that it would allow one to fight disinformation in the courts? Thank you.
Well, I can jump in and ask or answer the first question, or I'm not sure I really can answer it, because first of all, I would like to join in what Raul Rebani mentioned, that Ukraine is on the front and you're on a much higher level, and we're very humble regarding your knowledge. So it feels a bit weird to sit here and talk about our experiences while you are the ones really experiencing disinformation on its highest level. And there are a lot of different disinformation groups being produced now. I would argue that from a Swedish perspective, EU is the key leader for us when it comes to interaction. But also on a more national level, I'm foreseeing some more close cooperation between our countries. And I'm not going to mention what that is going to be in the future, but there are projects going on there also, or are in the beginning. And that's because we believe that there is a lot of knowledge to bring home from Ukraine. But if it would be to have an effective good dialogue, international good dialogue, I would argue that EU is the strong point here, because there are so many different tools. You don't fight disinformation with information. You fight disinformation with all available means, and EU is better there, I would say. Sorry, I couldn't give a straight answer, but that's as close as I can come.
Thank you so much, and I believe it's time for us to resume for today. From my side, thank you so much for the very, very important and very informative insights and information. And there's a lot of food for thought, which we could also take further for our tomorrow's event and discuss further with our participants. So Taras, Galina, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Дуже дякую. Ми вже так трошки перебрали час.
Thank you very much. We have really taken a bit more time, so we should really, conclude for today, and let's meet tomorrow.
Всім дякуємо.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. We cannot hear Helena, but please join us all tomorrow at our second working day. The link is the same, and we will start tomorrow at 2 p.m. Thank you. See you tomorrow. Thank you.